Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm very interdisciplinary. I mostly focus on the psychology of games in my own work, although I'm not technically a psychologist. I've taught in the humanities, in communication, English, and now I teach in game design. And as Cornell mentioned, I'm at Uppsala University, Campus Gotland, so here in the Baltic Sea. I'm also, we have a private company called Evocative Games AB that does consulting work and design work. And yeah, I've edited many things, but primarily the International Journal of Role Playing, but also NordicLARP.org, which might actually be more interesting to some of you, where we have documentation of different LARPs, for example, and with pictures and things. And then I have done a bunch of EU projects, a couple of which we will talk about today. We will be talking about Rocket, which is a game that a project that we developed for role-playing games in conflict transformation. So basically using role-playing games as a means to practice skills to handle conflict in the moment. And then also LARPocracy, which is our Horizon Europe grant, that is about using LARP to train skills in democracy and democratic values and behaviors. I'll wait for people to get settled back there. Okay. All right, so I wrote my dissertation actually in 2007 on the functions of role-playing games. And I don't know if you're familiar with this concept functionalism, but basically the idea that there are certain aspects of society that are there to help promote social cohesion. And my proposal was that role-playing games, which are quite new, 1974, as we'll see, is sort of considered the start of role-playing games, but role-playing as an activity is quite old. They serve certain functions. So the functions that I identified are creating community, so for example, enacting rituals, as we'll talk about, skill training, so building scenarios, problem solving within them, practicing pro-social behaviors, and then also identity exploration. So for example, learning how to explore different types of gender through games. So for those of you who are not familiar, what is a role-playing game? You might have heard this term RPG associated with video games. We're not talking specifically about that, although a lot of those games have their roots in what we're talking about. We're talking about enacting a character in a co-created fictional world, which creates this sort of what we call a magic circle of play. Not literally magic, although some people think of it as magic, where the social and physical rules of reality differ from everyday life. And while props and costumes may exist within these games, the fiction is mostly in the minds of the participants. This is a term called subjective diegesis, meaning that the game is not something out here, it's something that exists in our minds, and when we play, all of those viewpoints become what the game is, not just one. For that reason, we are also a first-person audience, which means that we are basically playing but also watching at the same time, rather than, as you are doing right now, watching. You're the audience, right? If you were up here and we were taking turns presenting, then it might be a first-person audience. So that has a very specific aspect to it. For one, it means that it's less performative, right? Although if you've seen things like Critical Role, those are quite performative, and that's because they've hired actors to play those roles that have skills and performance, and there is an audience. So it's a little bit of a hybrid form in a way, the fact that there's an audience. Usually in role-playing, there is no audience except the other players. And that means that people aren't under a ton of pressure to perform. It's more about expressing what feels natural in the moment through improvisation. While fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic fiction are common, role-playing games can be in any genre, setting, or theme. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are online role-playing games, so virtual or digital role-playing games, including single-player text-based or graphical-based RPGs. But we're mainly talking today about, as we mentioned, tabletop and live action role playing. So tabletop role playing is usually played around a table. Sometimes people have costumes, oftentimes not. And sometimes, depending on the game, there might be a character sheet with dice, and you roll dice to make certain actions. We call these representational mechanics. So you're not actually doing the thing, you are saying that your character is doing the thing, and then you're rolling a die to see if that thing happened. And it's so that's the typical sort of Dungeons and Dragons structure, but not all games conform to that by any means. And that's going to be true of basically everything I say today. Is there are many exceptions, so we're just going to go with it. Live action role playing is usually more physically embodied, sometimes with props in specific locations. For example, castles in Poland are actually really popular to come LARP in. And we're going to see one of those later in the images. So for those of you who did not raise your hand or were not here when the hand raising was happening, we were asking how many of you have actually role played before. You've probably played a role-playing game or something like it in the past. So these are what we call cousin forms of role-playing games. And this is specifically around tabletop, although this also applies to LARP. So childhood pretend play also has this spontaneous co-creative expression. So the difference between a digital game, oftentimes, and role-playing game analog is that you can spontaneously co-create together without the interface coming in between you and whatever it is you're describing. So basically, your imagination is the limit, in addition to whatever rules there are in the game that are facilitated. Childhood pretend play is usually a much looser structure. Children often play around with identity. They play around with roles. They engage in, chase play. But there's usually this kind of loose character or loose rules. Like the rules might change halfway through the game, for example. So when we start getting into role-playing game in adulthood and in adolescence, then you start seeing more rules, more structures, and a lot more of imposing of this is the way this fictional world works, and therefore there are ways to play within it and play outside of it incorrectly or correctly. So some of you may have experiences with some of these. Not everybody has imaginary friends or what we call transitional objects. So, for example, having a teddy bear that has a name and is alive, quote unquote. I mean, the child knows that the teddy bear is not alive, but they project consciousness into the teddy bear to have a friend, basically. Or it could be a blanket that becomes a cape with magical powers. But it's basically this psychological mechanism in which the child projects the imagination onto reality. And then there's paracosms, which are imaginary worlds. Those of you who are familiar with Lord of the Rings, which we'll talk about in a moment, that is an example of a paracosm. So J.R.R. Tolkien initially wrote basically the world. He wrote the languages first, then he wrote the world, and then he wrote the characters in the story. So he was developing this very vast paracosm, and this is something that we'll see lots of children do, which is create, for example, one of the examples in this book here is an entire train world. Somebody who's really into trains, so they're creating this world of trains. And then there's identity play, so pretending to be someone else. Batman, for example, really interesting research called the Batman effect, which is that when trying to do tasks that are challenging, this is in a laboratory setting, but they asked children to do a task that's difficult, and it was easier for them to keep doing that task when they pretended to be Batman. Relevant to what we were talking about a second ago. So sometimes characters can help us in daily life as well. Okay, so I mentioned social games a little bit. These are sometimes enacted in groups, and they often feature specific circumstances. So, for example, chase play like hide and seek, domestic play like playing house, professional play, playing school. I don't know if any of you played school before you came to school, but that is something people sometimes do. And then cops and robbers, so that's sort of like chase play plus professional play. It has a moral connotation, and here's some kids playing cops and robbers, probably a Halloween outfit. And then there's dark play, so sometimes bullying activities will be considered dark play, things that are non-consensual, for example. But they can be consensual. Sometimes dark play can be consensual. I won't get into that right now, but yeah. There's also board games and card games. We have a board game event this weekend, which is very cool. These can be collaborative, like Pandemic, or they can be competitive, like Monopoly. They sometimes use randomizers, like in role-playing games. And they often have objects that physically represent characters, items, and locations, so cards, miniatures, figures, tokens, terrain, that sort of thing. And so this is the kind of thing that moved its way into tabletop role-playing, are these like ways of representing the world on the table. Extensive role-playing in board games is not very common. So usually they have a role associated with the player's actions. So we have Miss Scarlet here from the game Clue. You could be playing an entire country like Russia in diplomacy. You could be playing a green planeswalker wizard in Magic the Gathering, or you could be playing a Pokemon trainer in the Pokemon card game. But these are light roles. They're not very enacted. Then there's strategy games. So there's ones that are focused on skills, such as remembering facts, like Trivial Pursuit, solving puzzles, Mahjong, improving communication, so Pictionary, counting cards, like in Bridge, and then social maneuvering, like in Werewolf. And then there's also resource gathering games, so land, wealth, treasures, allies. This is very, very common to have games about resources. Settlers of Catan, the Game of Life. These are examples of that. And then there's simulations, so games that are intended to play out specific scenarios for training purposes. So it could be healthcare, government, first responder training, military simulations. These are actually quite common, so acting out or even strategizing, as they're doing here, different types of scenarios and seeing what might happen. Practicing using weapons or other technologies, like, for example, practicing medical triage in the field, so assessing wounds, managing resources, simulating battles, and then communicating with actors who might be talking as if they are the local inhabitants of a country that the military is about to go to. So how did tabletop role-playing games emerge? So, officially speaking, Gary Gygax, who's one of the designers of Dungeons and Dragons, which came out in 1974, said he was inspired by the Conan novels, but he was very clearly also inspired by Lord of the Rings. We see a lot of the same races, which is not a great word to use anymore. We prefer the word species to describe different species within these fantasy genres. But we see elves, dwarves, very common and recognizable, that come from Lord of the Rings. Well, they come from far older, but they were made popular that way. There was also this huge movement of wargaming that became very popular. So people getting together and having these little planned battles, kind of like reenactment, but it's with dice and randomizers, so it's uncertain what will happen. Also, as I mentioned, the game Diplomacy, so it's a board game, but you would actually have people role-playing with each other as these different countries, and these had some like in-character correspondence. So some people are playing diplomacy with each other, you know, and sending letters to another country, for example. Military simulations designed for the RAND Corporation, or by the RAND Corporation for the U.S. Air Force. That's one of the roots of Dungeons and Dragons. The Society for Creative Anachronism, these are people who get together and they're really interested in like medieval and Renaissance culture, but they're also kind of doing it lovingly in this sort of new heritage way. And then there's also reenactment that's a lot more strict about having to have everything perfect. And then improvisational theater, which we'll talk about a little bit in the LARP section. So Dungeons and Dragons, this is facilitated by a game master who describes events and officiates actions, often via dice-based resolution mechanics. So there's usually one person facilitating, and that person is explaining the game as they go, and that person represents the entire game, and then everybody else just represents their characters. This is a very power-heavy structure, like where there's one person who has a lot of power, and the other players, they have incredible powers individually, but not as much power and influence over the world. There are other types of tabletop games that distribute that kind of creative power. But so players can basically come up with whatever they want, and the game master is supposed to react. So they can explore maps or explore different fictional locations. They can interact with other characters in the world. They can solve puzzles. They can plan tactics. This is very common because there's a lot of battles in Dungeons and Dragons. So if you have a group, being able to maximize on everybody's talents and use them at the right time can often be critical. They can also enact violence on other characters. That is very common in Dungeons and Dragons. They can gather treasure, sometimes called loot, as a result of killing things, basically. And then leveling up and becoming more powerful with experience. So while you can basically do anything in Dungeons & Dragons, at the same time the game encourages you towards a certain type of behavior. And it depends on the group, the degree to which it steers away from that. In traditional tabletop role-playing games, the actions are described usually in the third person, sometimes enacted in the first person, meaning they may say, my character does this, or they may say, I do this. Right? They often have character sheets with scores for abilities, mechanics, dice, etc. They might have quests, campaigns. So basically, it could be a one-shot, but oftentimes it's a campaign where there's many sessions. There's some people that have been playing Dungeons & Dragons for 50 years, the same campaign, or the same group, which is pretty amazing, actually. Same characters. Violence, as I said, a central component, et cetera, et cetera. There are other genres that talk about, instead of leveling up, de-evolving. So particularly in the horror genre, here's a picture from Cthulhu, Call of Cthulhu, which is a cosmic horror game that comes from the Cthulhu literature. Oftentimes it's about engaging with these dark forces and losing sanity, quote unquote, as they are exposed to this malevolence entities. Defeat is highly probable, sometimes even inevitable in these games. Then there's World of Darkness games. These often focus on flawed characters who experience personal horror within a dangerous or corrupted world that resembles our own, but is not the same as our own. And it has a strong element of social commentary. Instead of clear-cut heroes, the characters represent some aspects of what we call the monstrous, and I've written some papers on this. So in Vampire the Masquerade, vampires are like these political animals that are trying to preserve their humanity, or maybe not. Maybe they're leaning into being the beast. They're basically immortal parasites. And then in Werewolf the Apocalypse, they're trying to preserve the soul of the earth from corruption. But they have this all-consuming rage for the desecration of the planet. And then in Mage the Ascension, they're struggling to avoid becoming megalomaniacs, so becoming these like all-powerful beings that no longer are tethered to this world, while learning how to bend reality to their own will. So unlike in something like Dungeons and Dragons, where you just get a spell and you can do it, and there's absolutely no repercussions for doing that spell usually, in Mage, reality actually bites back at you. There's lots of other games, indie role-playing games, for example, stripping down a lot of those core mechanics, distributing the creative agency around the world, around the player group. Some of them are GM-less, meaning there isn't one person who's facilitating. Really popular one is called Fiasco, a game of personal ambition and poor impulse control. So this is inspired by cinematic tales of small-time capers gone disastrously wrong. So this is kind of the opposite of Dungeons and Dragons. Your characters are supposed to fail terribly and in a very amusing way, and it's a one-shot. So it's not, you're not intending for these characters to play through multiple sessions. They usually fail horribly due to hubris, greed, or ineptitude. And it uses dice, but mainly only to convey randomized bits of story or to describe how characters badly fail. So they're using the fun of rolling the dice, but it's twisting it because the dice don't actually mean what you think they usually mean. So it subverts the expectations of traditional role-playing games. Then there's Apocalypse World. This is a very, very influential game. It also has stripped-down mechanics, and it has moves, and these emphasize telling an interesting story. So they're very similar to Dungeons and Dragons in the fact that you have different statistics and you roll dice to see if what you want to do works. You do have a couple of skills, but it's very stripped down. So the focus is on the story rather than the game. And the person who's playing the dungeon master is not the adversary that's trying to, defeat you, but actually the person who's trying to help you tell the most interesting story. There's a focus on survival, but also relationships, and a strong sense of lethality in that game. So this game spawned probably, there are hundreds probably, but maybe even thousands of games that are under this sort of powered by the apocalypse label. And that means that basically they were totally fine, although this is also true with Dungeons & Dragons to a degree, they were totally fine with people hacking their game and making their own game based on it. So Dungeon World is a famous one, Monster Hearts, and Dream Askew. Those two are some of my personal favorites. Then there's weird stuff like Idris B. This is a Norwegian game about 1920s surrealism, and it's a dreamlike setting with unpredictable things happening. It also has these stripped down mechanics, but there's an emphasis on improvisation. So for example, adding new bits of fiction with yes but, or yes and no and. These are techniques from improvisational role-playing that when somebody offers you a piece of fiction, you respond by saying, yes, and this other thing happened, or yes, but it didn't happen exactly the way you remember. So it's a way of passing the ball back with a bit more of the improvisation. It not only subverts the expectations of RPGs in terms of having this ambiguous win condition, but also in terms of the tangibility of reality itself and the linearity of time. So it's a pretty surreal experience to play this tabletop game. So from this section, tabletop games, as we'll see with LARP as well, are similar to other forms of playfulness, games and simulation. They are widely used in a variety of themes and mechanics. They are highly influential, especially on the structure of virtual games. So you might be familiar with some of these if you've played, for example, World of Warcraft or other kinds of MMORPGs. And they are always evolving into new and experimental forms. You've also probably played it, yes, played a LARP or something like it. Yes, go ahead. Yeah?
Okay. So, because I see a certain trend in the story you told about the different RPGs evolving, that they are less and less mechanical, as you've mentioned. So I wonder if you have in mind any more recent RPG that is also so popular as the older ones, but is also so complicated in terms of mechanics, or is it rather a trend that every next generation of RPG is less and less complicated?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm also showing my bias here because to me, in terms of time, there's sort of like Dungeons and Dragons and World of Darkness, and then there's this huge turn with story games. And, a lot of games have been created out of the story games tradition. It's actually quite complex to make that kind of rule system work and to publish it. So I would say they definitely exist. I mean, I've seen a My Little Pony game that had a bunch of mechanics in it, you know. It's very cool. But I would say that they are, there's more demand actually these days for games that are actually more pared down. The market has changed quite a bit in terms of the demographics, the makeup, and people are less patient to learn all of these rules as part of it as well. So even Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is much more stripped down than the original games are. And it's meant to be played by beginners, which was very difficult to do back in the old days. Yeah. Yeah. So as I said before, for those of you who came late, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and ask it. If you have a comment, let's save it for the end, okay? Cool. All right, so some cousin forms of LARP. I talked already about improvisation. This is a famous book about improv that I highly recommend by Keith Johnstone. Sometimes it's for a group, so sometimes you're only improvising with your other drama people in a theater group, for example, but sometimes it's for an audience, a third-person audience. Often improv is comedic, although not always, and it usually involves very short scenes and characters that are there just for the purposes of making people laugh in the moment. But there's also something called long-form improv, which is repeated enactment of certain characters in new settings and situations. And then there's things that are called theater sports. So these are kind of game-like in that you can get points for, you know, winning the scene, for example, but it's based on improvisation. Similarly, we already talked about simulation and educational role-playing. So for example, here we can see some folks engaging in standardized patient role play. I've done this before. A friend of mine worked at a simulation lab for nursing students, and so we played difficult patients that these nursing students had to interact with in some way. So these are often connected to, simulations are often connected to some sort of professional skill. So in the military, in education, government, healthcare, therapy, as we'll discuss in a moment, but also business simulation. So role-playing out how to be a better salesperson or how to be a better leader or, you know, team building exercises, that kind of thing. Then there's therapeutic role-playing. So this is usually intended to evoke a certain response or practice related to emotional growth. So here we have some family constellation therapy. Basically, the person in the middle sort of serves as the protagonist, and they are describing either something internal to them, so parts that are within themselves that they are asking people to embody outside of them so that they can everybody can physically see in the room how these aspects relate to each other. Or it could be a family dynamic out in the real world, in which case it's not a literal representation of what's happening, but more of like a psychological representation. And the person can ask, like the facilitator might say something like, you know, okay, what would feel better in this scene? It's like, well, maybe if my dad wasn't turned away from me and instead he was looking towards me, for example. There are many of these. I'm not going to go into too much depth, but basically the term role-playing is attributed to Jacob Moreno, who started psychodrama and sociodrama in the 1930s. There's also drama therapy, Gestalt, internal family systems. And then in community activism, there's this theater of the oppressed, which is a very interesting technique, usually having actors, but they work within the group to portray the conflicts that the group is describing, usually related to power and marginalization. Yes. So basically, like if we were to do this here, maybe we would be the actors, and we would ask you what sorts of challenges you're facing in your group. And you might say, oh, well, you know, our teacher doesn't let us have breaks in between long lectures with guest lectures, for example. Hopefully that's not the case here. And then we might act that out, how that feels. And then you could, for example, tap in and replace that person and try the thing. And so we've done some simulated play like that was it was forum theater based or theater of the oppressed based, where we had two students that were in this psychiatric situation with a person who was in a lot of pain or is having a psychiatric break or something, and then other people would be able to pop in and tap in and try the thing sometimes if they wanted to. But it is more audience in a way. It's a participatory audience, if that makes sense. All right, so to the types of LARPs. There's Boffer LARP. These terms all have different names depending on where you're from. But physical combat with weapons, often made out of foam, which we call boffers. They tend to feature adventures and quests, puzzles, problem solving, strategy. So very similar in a lot of ways to Dungeons and Dragons and other traditional tabletop games, but you're physically enacting these battles. Sometimes they have real steel, but generally they don't. There is live steel combat. It's pretty intense. But then there often are factions, because instead of there are factions often in tabletop as well, but you're sort of representing one of those, or maybe your group is a faction. But in LARP, your main interaction is with the other players, not with the game master. So the factions all have to have a reason to have some sort of drama or conflict. But you also have individual characters often that have specific abilities or status, but also limitations. One of the first ones in the UK, 1982, Treasure Trap. There's also Nero in the United States. Hobbit games in Russia. Russia had a very interesting development because they didn't have access to Dungeons and Dragons, but they had access to Tolkien. So there was this strong group of hippies, basically, in the woods who started playing out Hobbit games. And that has developed into a lot of other games. Drachenfest in Germany and Dystopia Rising in the United States are just some examples. And Drachenfest and I would say Conquest of Mythodia and Drachenfest are probably the biggest LARPs in the world. They get up to, I don't know what they're up to these days, but between 5,000 and 10,000 people. Boffer LARP, this can also have other kinds of things. It's not all combat, depending on the game. So perhaps artistic expression, crafting, doing performances, reenacting specific events, cultural activities related to these societies within the game, and also, similar to Vampire, a lot of political play with very clear social hierarchies and maneuvering within them. Some cousin forms, as I mentioned before, the Society of Creative Anachronism. They don't want to call themselves LARPers, but they're kind of LARPing. This is actually a running theme for a lot of the things we're talking about, because SCA and Renaissance festivals were technically predate LARP. And so then when LARP comes up, they want to say, oh, well, that's not what we're doing this other thing. But actually, it's like you're running around playing a character and role-playing, so you're kind of LARPing. One thing to consider in terms of these terms, because we mentioned how complicated it can be to use the terminology, is that if it arose from a specific lineage, like we mentioned Hobbit games, if it arose from there, or if it arose from Dungeons and Dragons, then we can think of it as a role-playing game. So sociodrama from the 1930s doesn't count in that way. It has its own lineage, and it started its own lineage in a way. But it is a cousin form. Yes, and then there's cosplay, which often is about physically portraying the character, but sometimes there is a role-play element. The difference between cosplay and role-play is that other people aren't also playing a fictional world with you. It's mainly just one person playing the character. Some people might come up and try to interact with that character, but we're not all pretending to be in that fictional world. Then there's Chamber LARP. It's called lots of different things. So Parlor LARP, theater style, UK freeform, interactive literature, and then in China, Jubensha. So this often contains social play, including politics and romance, representational combat. So instead of having the big boffer swords, you might do rock, paper, scissors, or you might draw cards or something, or you might just, sort of theatrically act out that you shoot someone and you fall over. And then indoor locations as opposed to outdoor play, hence the term chamber. It happens in some sort of chamber. They tend to have elaborative storylines, not always, and historical content or themes is common. So Vampire the Masquerade became a very popular series of LARPs. That's how I actually started LARPing at 19, that are played all over the world, and those are chamber LARPs generally. In Intercon Interactive Fiction in the US, there's also a similar tradition in Finland, which is very, very complex character sheets, pages and pages that you have to faithfully recreate when you're playing the game. And then Czech Chamber LARP, Jubencha in China. So Jubencha is a murder mystery that was imported from the UK in around 2013, and then has become this massive worldwide phenomenon since then. There are more Chinese LARPers than there are anywhere else in the world, probably, in the last 10 years. It's become pretty remarkable. And they are making so many of these Jubencha games that they are importing them out. And so lots of Southeast Asians play these games. And even in Brazil, there's a UK group that's playing Jubencha. So it came from the UK and then came back as a totally different thing, but inspired by. Unfortunately, the government is censoring these, so it's unclear where they will go. But it's also a quite big industry there. So there's these like high luxury, thousands and thousands of dollars, the equivalent to play a Jubencha, which we haven't quite got there yet, in other parts of the world. And I'm going to use a generic term called collaborative LARP. It's called emergent LARP sometimes. Sometimes it's called Nordic LARP, although that's a very specific movement, I would say, or Nordic-inspired LARP. So there's lots of things I've heard about Nordic LARP and have therefore adapted their play style accordingly, or have actually gone to a Nordic LARP and then brought the techniques back home. But there's lots of people who've been doing Nordic-like LARP all over. It just didn't have as much of a, as many journalists and academics that are publishing papers and making it very visible. So instead of having competition, like doing certain mechanics to see if you win, it tends to be collaborative. It emphasizes a shared narrative. So instead of playing to win, you're playing for drama or for the story or to lift others up or even to lose. So playing to have a really bad thing happen to your character so you can feel all of the emotions and have a catharsis around that. There tend to be little to no mechanics at all in these LARPs. So it's all about what you see is what you get with your body. Sometimes there's even an emphasis on 360-degree illusion, which means everything that you're seeing is actually part of the LARP. So there wouldn't be cell phones if it was a medieval game, for example. And then they tend to have socially realistic settings, so serious themes, for example, eroticism or oppression or suffering, violence, very realistically enacted out violence. And I promised you a Polish castle. Here is one right here. This is probably the most famous LARP, other than Jubencha in the world, is College of Wizardry, which started in 2014, and there are several offshoots. They are these blockbuster LARPs, sometimes are called destination LARPs or tourism LARPs or castle LARPs. So you pay quite a bit of money, not compared to a normal vacation, to be honest, but if you're paying between 5 to 1,000 euros to go play a LARP, that's usually a lot more expensive than the average LARP. And they're usually played in these desirable locations, so castles or battleships, and they often have recognizable settings. So I played one of these recently in Alvernia, and this really cool space dome thing, and we were it's called Eclipse, and we were colonizing a planet and interacting with quote-unquote alien life. We were the aliens there, So that was extremely immersive and very cool because we were on a movie set, essentially. And then there's high production values and brute force design sometimes. So there's often a lot of things happening to keep people entertained rather than sitting and being with your feelings. So College of Wizardry and New World Magischola, there's several of these wizard LARPs out there now. Moneta Surlestra, which was a Battlestar Galactica LARP played on an actual museum ship. And then Dragon Thrones in the US. And then there's freeform. So the LARPs that I'm going to be describing to you are more like freeform. And you'll notice that we used the term freeform earlier to refer to the UK. They have a very specific style of freeform. They call it that, but it's not exactly what we're talking about here. So we're really meaning Nordic or American freeform here, sometimes called Jeep form. Anyway, the important thing is that they have both LARP and tabletop characteristics. So it may be more or less embodied. They tend to be quite short scenarios. You often don't need any kind of costuming. They're played in neutral locations, like a classroom, for example. And they tend to be heavily facilitated, although not always, by a game master. And they may set very discrete scenes that you act out and then break character and then on to the next scene. So the narrative is often sort of predetermined to a degree. And then they have these, instead of mechanics, they have what are called meta techniques. So for example, calling for a monologue and hearing the inner thoughts of the character for a moment. The characters don't hear that, but the players do. So it's meant to enhance the narrative rather than decide whether or not somebody wins or loses. There are many of these conventions. Actually, I'm in a project, I mentioned LARPocracy. We are studying how many of these conventions and festivals there are. And they have a massive list now, but some examples are Festival in Denmark, Stockholm Scenario Festival in Sweden, Grandislandet and Dreamation, and Immersion in Story in Finland. And there are also online versions of these scenarios you can play, such as the Golden Cobra competition and the #Feminism nanogame anthology. And finally, we have Black Box LARP. So this is kind of like if any of you have been in experimental theater before, where they have a black box and they're doing some kind of artistic things within there. So usually black boxes don't have an audience, so it's mainly just things that are happening, for example, a rehearsal space, but sometimes they do. So it's minimalist, there's sparse costumes and props. It's played in a space that's, neutral. Usually there are also, though, lights and sound, so you can create some cool effects. And there's often very abstract representations of things, so time, setting, characters, relationships. There may be unusual physicalization or vocalization, so there might be a nonverbal LARP. These are very common in Black Box. And sometimes it might be a place within a larger LARP. So you could go to the black box and play out a specific scene. Sometimes that's called a meta room. This is one of the most influential black box LARPs. It's called White Death by Nina Runa Essendrop and Simon Steen Hansen. Those balloons, it's humans trying to survive, early humanity trying to survive during a blizzard. The balloons represent I believe your dreams, so you could go up and pop someone's balloon. There's no talking, and you could barely move your body. You can only move your body in very specific ways. So it's meant to sort of represent this weird struggle to be in this human form. And then eventually they all die, and they become the white ones, and they get to dance because their souls are free. So, yeah. Very different from Dungeons & Dragons, I would say. Famous one called Delirium, which was about a large-scale LARP about love and madness in an asylum. White Death, so again, the struggle for human life, peace and death. And then Saraband, which is one of my personal favorites, which is about, you're playing these Parisians in the turn of the century, and you're making art and engaging with each other. So role-playing is a human thing, so it may include character embodiment, community building rituals, interactive storytelling, fiction writing, puzzles, problem solving, symbolic enactment, and hopefully at this point you can see that basically you can do anything your mind can imagine, and that some of these forms might be better than others for that. Yes? No, don't apologize. Yeah.
Okay. Two questions to the classification, because I got lost in one aspect about the buffer games. Mm-hmm. Yes, because the picture there shows something that looks like a chamber LARP at some point, like on the next slide. And I wanted to make sure if I understand correctly that this kind of historical games, for example, mm-hmm. which focus on plot and character the stories and so on would still count as buffer LARPs if they are in historic setting? In
I would
this,
I would call them chamber LARPs unless they have boffer weapons that people are using. But sometimes those historical LARPs, like Regency LARPs, for example, where people go and play Jane Austen for 3 days, that's not a boffer LARP or a chamber LARP. It's more like probably a collaborative LARP or maybe a UK freeform. Sometimes those are competitive, actually, but they don't have weapons.
and one more question,
Yeah.
because I failed to grasp when the chamber LARP exactly becomes black box LARP. Because, for example, I've met the classification which the White Death or Spellbound and so on are classified as the chamber LARPs. And for the first time, I see this classification of black box LARP, and I wanted to make sure if this is about the abstraction and minimalism or every situation in which it's just not exactly typical? Like, where's this line?
That's a great question, and I don't actually know the answer. What I would say is that black box usually has sound and lights, whereas a freeform game won't, for example. So, but that's, you can play a freeform and play a song, and then it technically has audio. But are there theatrical sound and lights that are happening? That being said, people will use black box to refer to lots of things. So this is why it gets really confusing to try to even create these categories. But hopefully, a chamber LARP is usually not super abstract in the same way that a black box LARP is, for example. Now, the picture here is, I don't know why that's happening. I think it has these two microphones don't like each other. This is a dance that's happening inside the context of a 2,000-person UK boffer LARP. So people are out there fighting during the day, and then at night they have a ball. Yeah. It's called Empire. Sure. There are, though, boffer LARPs where there's really not a lot of role play and social play. Like AmpGuard in the US is mostly just a sport LARP. People, they have characters, they have names, but they're not really role playing other than fighting. Okay, how much time do we have? Great. So how might role-playing games enhance social science didactics? So the teaching of social science. We're going to get to a little bit more boring territory, but here we go. Boring maybe for some folks. So my bold claim is that role-playing games can be used to teach anything if they have the proper framing. Some people, think that they're better suited for certain kinds of activities than others. That's probably true, but I think they can be used in any kind of didactic situation. They can teach many skills at once. So, for example, social skills, content revision. So it's best not to teach the content during the LARP. It's best to teach it before the LARP. And then when they go into the LARP or the tabletop, they can practice it. They can revise it or master it. Because it can be very distracting when you're playing to try to learn new information. You can hack an existing LARP to your current educational context or existing tabletop. So, for example, people often use Pathfinder or other kinds of tabletop systems and then just use it in an educational setting with framing around it. Or they design their own. This is called bespoke design. But the important thing is that role-playing games are rituals, even in their basic form or their more informal or leisure form. So there's the preparation stage beforehand, there's this liminal stage in the middle, and then there's this incorporation stage at the end. And during this liminal stage, people are sort of between, they're trying different kinds of social identities, they're engaging in the ritual that has different roles, and then they leave and they incorporate what they learned into life. So the important thing here is that the game itself is not enough, right? It has to have this framing around it, this ritualization, to be able to take whatever is learned in the game and make it transferable out into the world. And we'll go into the theory behind that later, but if you stick around for the next lecture. So there's this thing called educational framing. So you have these learning objectives that are very clear, and they frame all of the design. So, you know, if you wanted to have, maybe that's not the best example, but like if you wanted to have a game that's about experiencing loss and grieving loss, then maybe D&D isn't the best game for you. Now, people do process loss very intensely in D&D. Like if they've been playing the same character for 3 years and that character dies, it's usually a very profound moment for everybody outside. But there's all sorts of other things that are happening that are not about loss, right? In fact, most of them are about winning. So it might actually detract to use that particular game system for that particular purpose. So having clear learning objectives that frame all of the design, and this is what we teach in our program, which means that sometimes we have to throw out the fun creative stuff that we really want to put in there that's just, you know, exciting and to focus on, yes, these learning objectives. So having lectures beforehand or homework or workshops, some other learning activity to prepare, this is where most of the new content should come in. Then there's the liminal space, the game itself. So as I said, they take on these different identities. They behave in ways that are different than their daily selves. And then they experience this ritual together. So it creates a sense of communitas for the people that take part in it. And that strengthens the bonds of the community. That's why I was asking about communitas earlier, a couple days ago. And it creates what Emil Durkheim called collective effervescence. So if you've ever been in a collective activity like a concert or some sort of group activity where it just feels sort of magical all of a sudden and everybody's on the same wavelength, that's what he calls collective effervescence. Then we have post-game activities, and this is actually the most important thing, and it's the thing that's least designed with educational games. Including a lot of the educational board games and things that I've been learning about this week, often there isn't a lot of built-in mechanisms for educational purposes after the game. So yes, there are cool things happening within the game structure, but also after the game, there should be some form of debriefing usually. So some form of discussing what happened, usually structured around those goals. To put it plainly, transformation and learning transfer is less likely to occur without this debriefing phase. But there are other forms of integration. These are processes that can help cement that knowledge or integrate it into our lives. Creative expression, intellectual analysis, emotional processing. So, for example, I mentioned NordicLARP.org earlier today. That website is a bunch of intellectual analysis of these games that people have played, including articles by myself. It's the way I deal with things, usually, how I get a LARP out of my system. But then there's also emotional processing, usually one-on-one or in groups, and then practices to sort of return to daily life, interpersonal processing, and community building. So emotional processing can happen individually, so journaling, for example, about one's feelings. Interpersonal processing might be debriefing with your friends after. Yes?
So the debriefing and the rolling itself is already the part of the integration activities, or it's only after we, or the integration activities are only the moment when we already went our separate ways and no longer sit in the same room and discuss?
Very, very good question. I consider it in here, and if we have a much longer list on our article, which you can find on NordicLARP.org, on transformative role-playing, me and Kjell Hugos. But it's part of this, one of these two phases, actually here. But it's not the only one. So a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about a game right after the experience, and so debriefing might not be the best for them. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but you might want to let them pass and listen. They might actually be much more interested in journaling about it afterwards, or making a piece of art, or some other kind of activity. Great question. Okay, so I was about to give you a whole bunch of skills. I don't know if we want to get into that, but I think we'll do it really quickly. So shaping our paradigm through a first-person perspective. So you can become more motivated. So if you want your students, for example, if you're an educator to be more motivated, you might use games. Become more engaged in the subject. Improve their perceived competence in the subject matter. I mean, sometimes when you just learn something in a class, you might feel very incompetent at it, but when you actually get to practice it in a game and you're successful, or even if you're not successful, maybe you feel more competent at that or able to do things. And this can include internal and external political efficacy. So meaning, does someone feel like they are able to engage politically? And do they feel like the world will respond to their engagement politically? And then trying to understand abstract concepts, sometimes that's much easier when you're in this first-person perspective. So if you want people to understand, for example, democracy, which we're studying, how do you make that embodied? And that can help also develop empathy for the people who are involved in that activity. And then anytime skill training is required, that would normally happen on the job, experiential or situated learning, and then again to help with subject matter revision. Okay, so some of our projects. We often are asked to do certain things that are not necessarily what we would have chosen to do, but that's kind of a fun challenge, right? One of them, as I mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher, so we were approached by Circus at Uppsala University. Sadly, not a real circus, but it's a center for interdisciplinarity. They are mainly in humanities and the social sciences, but they also branch out into other fields such as health services. We created this book, Role-Playing Games for Interdisciplinary Collaborations. These are free-form. Everything I'm going to tell you about is free-form. It's very basic scenarios, short scenarios. They focus on common conflicts in interdisciplinary research groups at different stages of the grant writing process. So this is a very specific target group. These are academics that want to get money and need to work interdisciplinarily with each other. However, we have reskinned this game for game designers, for example. So if you're in a game design team with a programmer and a graphic designer, how do you get everybody on the same page? So it can really be, this format can be used for lots of different group work settings, essentially. So most scenarios have different characters that are in different backgrounds or job roles. So the primary investigator, the social scientist, the artistic practitioner, the technophile, the health scientist, the research assistant, the project manager. So each of these characters have certain ways of looking at the world based on their position, but also they have specific needs, specific fears. So you can bring that emotional and personal element into the character sheets, and I'll show you that in a moment. So a lot of simulation is really based on the role, like the surface role, whereas a lot of deeper role-playing games are based on the complex motivations, the biases, our you know, the kinds of interests that we have that affect play. And the character descriptions are kept relatively short and open to interpretation. This is also a best practice in educational role-playing game design in general. Most students are not going to read a 12-page character sheet, and there will be too much information anyway. So, I mean, I don't even like 12-page character sheets. So, having something quite short. So common ground, very quickly, it's a scenario that is about the first research meeting. Then there's the deadline where they've already put a draft together, but things have to be cut, so what's going to be cut? So this is about conflict resolution / transformation, learning nonviolent communication skills. The pitch session, so trying to synthesize lots of different ideas into one abstract and pitch it, and then they get evaluated. The committee, where you actually play the assessors, the people on the other side of the role. And then the prenup. And those assessors also are interdisciplinary in a way. They have different biases and interests. And then the prenup. So the idea is that when you are in an interdisciplinary or any kind of research project, you should definitely plan ahead of time where you're going to publish, how much you're going to publish, who's going to be first author, these kinds of things that actually matter a lot in academia, but we don't often talk about until it's kind of too late. So here's an example character sheet, the social scientist. You want to understand how people and social dynamics work. You hold a strong belief that with sufficient rigor and good methodological practice, you can be part of cracking the code of what makes people behave the way they do. You believe all patterns of human behavior, including psychology, social behavior, and culture, can be measured. Such observations, when tested repeatedly over time, can yield defensible inferences that will advance social science as a field. You want to be at the center of this important work. So you get some choices. You can choose kind of what your methodological orientation is. But then you have these needs. So you need to publish more articles so you can qualify for promotion. You need to get funding. You need to be recognized. Or you fear that the collaborators won't take this seriously, you know, this is real science, or that they will not follow through with the necessary data collection. This is a big problem in a lot of projects. People say that they're going to do all this stuff and then they don't actually do it, and then your peers will accuse you of publishing quote-unquote bad science because it's interdisciplinary, or it's based in conjecture or unscientific thinking. So the sort of counterpart to this character is the artist practitioner who just, you know, wants to create art. And so they are in this sort of dynamic tension. Time check? Perfect. This is the assembly. This is the game that we're going to be running tomorrow. I would love to have folks. It's only 5 to 8 players. It's designed for this LARPocracy project that I mentioned. The idea is to teach deliberative, to actually create a deliberative event that is in character, where we're practicing democratic deliberative skills. And the idea is that you get people from lots of different walks of life all in the same room, a representative sample, and you give them a topic and they will share their reasons and they will listen to one another, and they'll be willing to change their mind. So it's this very, very structured practice of political conversation that's moderated. And the goal after all of that talking is to figure out what policy recommendations they might want to send to Parliament, which are then actually given to Parliament. In this case, we were inspired by a recent deliberative event called the Citizens Parliament in Finland, which focused on the legalization of cannabis. So this is a very topical and hopefully interesting topic to deliberate about. We could be deliberating about anything, but we wanted to pick something that was interesting and engaging, but wasn't going to be so sensitive that, you know, it could make it difficult for the players to engage. And so in this case, they deliberate on the decriminalization or legalization of psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, which is an ongoing and actually quite a big trend right now in terms of the legal discourse around these drugs. And they talk about this with regard to medical, spiritual, or recreational purposes. So these participants are diverse. They have different demographics, political beliefs, different life experiences. And this type of game design allows us to embed the characters with very strong memories, very emotional responses, and strong beliefs. So we're sort of using our game design skills to make it even more intense than it might be in a real deliberative event. So as you can see, we have, first of all, a content advisory, so safety is important. So when we have certain kinds of topics, we put it in the sheet ahead of time. So in this case, this person is involved in organized religion, they've experienced a robbery, and they have PTSD. So this is a 61-year-old cis woman, middle class, Christian. This is based in Sweden, by the way. Whether they call themselves Christians or not is a whole other story, but in this case, she believes in God but does not go to church. She's a centrist, or she perceives herself as such, but she has only completed high school. And she's from another Nordic country other than Sweden. And she grew up rurally. So all of the characters have some combination of these factors in some way. But then when we get into her character sheet, you try to listen to all sides of an issue before making a decision. However, when it comes to drugs, you draw the line. You were mugged once at a train station in the city and are convinced that that young man stole your purse to purchase more drugs. You wish you never had to encounter drug addicts in public places, and you get anxious every time you have to go back to the city to see your family. While you know that many drug addicts come from hard situations and may have needed to resort to crime to survive, you don't see an excuse for using hard drugs. You've been living with chronic migraines for decades and have never asked for medication from a doctor. You even avoid using over-the-counter pain relievers because you're afraid you will get hooked. You've come to accept pain as your lot in life and believe that other people just need to toughen up. So this is a very specific perspective that gives the character a reason to engage when they come. You know, we could also write the character, you don't really know what to think, but then they don't have much to work with, right? So we're able to seed different kinds of nuanced perspectives in this way. But then, because the idea behind the LARP is for people to eventually maybe change their mind, if they feel persuaded. Before you joined the assembly, you thought all drugs were basically the same and highly addictive, and even quote-unquote safe drugs from the pharmacy, like Ipren. After reading the fact sheet, so they read this fact sheet before they come, and that fact sheet is supposed to be what they all agree upon that is true. This is very challenging in our post-truth society these days, but after reading the fact sheet, you were extremely confused to read that psilocybin is not highly addictive, but you're not sure you understood all the terms on the fact sheet either, many of which you had never heard before, right? So the player can choose how much to lean into any of these elements. They can choose whether to tell any of this backstory. Maybe they don't feel comfortable doing that in this setting, but it is informing the things that they do. So in this game, I usually don't like during debriefs when people tell everybody about their character because it tends to derail the learning. But in this case, it actually makes sense to do that because you can understand, if the idea is to develop an understanding of people with different perspectives, that's much easier to do when you learn a little bit about what's going on for them. And then we give them a strength of conviction. In this case, she's strongly convicted, even though she doesn't fully understand what's going on, which is a lot of people. Right. And then finally, we have Erasmus Rocket. This is a critical virtual exchange where people get together from different universities, in this case, Göttingen, Uppsala, and Groningen. And we have these very short role-play scenarios where they engage in conflict with one another and practice specific skills related to that. So identifying their positions, their interests, their feelings and needs, which is very similar to what we were just designing around in this other scenario. But it's more improvisational and it's very short. So the idea is to get people in a state of conflict so they feel the rising emotion, which can actually happen within seconds of a conflict starting, even a fictional conflict. It's really impressive, actually. And then to practice noticing those things, practice different styles of engaging with conflict, and so on. So ideally, they will see how difficult these things are to do in practice, but also to have an embodied sense of what it feels like to actually practice that skill. Yeah. So person A is confronting person B about a specific conflict. Person C is either witnessing or in some way involved in the conflict. This is the extent of the scenario. This is all we give them. So let's say student A is upset because student B hasn't been answering their texts. Student C just wants to stay out of it but is part of the group, you know. So the main two people are person A and person B, but person C is also involved. And this allows this is a very facilitator-heavy game, so bringing more students in is better, because it's 3 to 1, basically, or 1 to 3, sorry, or 1 to 6, if you have a group of 6. So I don't think we have time for the example role play, but basically you will hopefully have access to these slides at some point. You can watch it yourself, or you can watch it on YouTube. The idea is to have these meta techniques we talked about before, like the monologue, to allow people to have some insight into each other's characters and to role play the conflict very quickly. All right, so this was sort of my question geared towards teachers, but this could also be interesting for those of you who are students. Like, what would you think might be fun to role play, to learn in a more embodied way in your studies? Or any other questions or comments you might have.
Any questions? I don't think so.
How practical do you find the discussion about the definitions at all? Are these really important, or should we just, focus on the particularities of the other part?
They're both terribly important and not important at all, is the problem. So when you're embedded in these communities, these debates can happen for weeks at a time, right? Or years, right? And so you're trying to figure out what's the most meaningful thing that I can share with students to let them know. There is kind of this distinction between these two different parts, but it'll be called different things. And sometimes somebody will use a word that you think, we're like, wait a minute, I thought a black box was this other thing, but you're using it to mean this thing. And this is especially true with these independent or more experimental groups like Nordic LARP, where the rules are constantly changing anyway, so it doesn't actually always fit. But it helps to figure out, for example, as a game designer, what kind of game you want to make. Do you want to make a game for a classroom where they don't have to have costumes? Well, maybe look at other freeform games. Do you want to make a game that is like really kind of artsy and in this like really cool sort of theater space that, or maybe uses like intense drama therapy? Maybe you need a lot of lights and sound to make that happen, maybe a black box. If you want to do a very historical game and you want everything to be perfect, you want to have the right costumes and, to have it be this like, really realistic political drama, then maybe you want to actually have like a more a blockbuster location or some other kind of location. So all of those choices really matter in terms of production and implementation, which is a whole other topic that we won't get into here.
And on the other topic, a lot of this revolves around Western culture and US and Europe based. You mentioned Jubencha games. Are there any other examples that you may maybe share with us of things that originated in other cultures, and how do they fit in the educational context?
Yeah, I can't get into a lot of detail here, but Brazil has a quite vibrant role-playing game, educational role-playing game even, community. They've actually been running edu-RPG conferences since the early 2000s, which I think is really interesting. And they recently had one for like 2,000 people all across Brazil. And Brazil is quite large and geographically diverse, so having everybody able to join in virtually to connect like that, it's also quite challenging to travel sometimes financially, so it's pretty remarkable that they're bringing people from all over to do that. And we were invited to talk, which was very cool. And they also have a very artsy LARP scene too. It's mostly chamber LARPs. And a lot of them are also involved in academia, so there's publications. But I mean, a lot of the materials, there's actually a history of Brazilian LARP on the International Journal of Role Playing. A lot of the stuff that they were playing came from the U.S. So it's like they were doing. It's very common for communities to use photocopiers to like take a D&D book and then just photocopy it and then pass it out because it's so expensive to have these books. So the degree to which anything is strictly Brazilian, that's challenging, right? Because there's these influences from these other games. But it's definitely its own unique LARP culture. They even have their own manifesto on the NordicLARP.org website. So yeah, that's an example. There's lots of others. But in our course, we actually have a whole section where people can choose from different places in the world and read about different LARPs. So I'm very interested in LARP and tabletop from all over. Okay, so at their core, role-playing games create space for participants to experience agency, empowerment, what's called internal locus of control. An internal locus of control means that someone feels like they have agency in the world. They can affect the world. The world is not happening to them. That would be external. They are happening to the world. Of course, it's always both, right? But oftentimes when we have an internal locus of control, we might feel more empowered. Now, apparently this is a very Western concept, maybe individualistic concept, so it depends on the culture, but this is one of the things that psychologists will often try to develop in people. Experimentation with social rules, collaboration, perspective taking, so taking the perspective of another person and developing empathy, hopefully, for other people. and then meta-reflection. So engaging in this moment between the self and the character where there's some sort of reflection happening. Okay, so big question, what is transformation? We use our own definitions for this. You will find many different definitions, likely. Ours is based in part in conflict transformation theory. So transformation can be a prolonged and sustained state of change, so a state. So going from in character to out of character is a state change. So that is a very temporary state change, though. Usually doesn't take that long, hopefully, for us to completely leave the character. Sometimes the emotions will last, and we'll talk about bleed later, but the state change between in-game and off-game actually happens quite quickly. But this is a prolonged and sustained state of change. Now, we're not saying that people should stay in their characters indefinitely, but there's some sort of change within them that becomes substantiated into their daily identity. And then there's also a process. So change is a process or a series of processes that lead to growth. This means that the game itself is generally a catalyst or maybe a part of someone's transformational journey. The game doesn't change people, right? The game creates conditions where change can happen. And sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. When inspired by role-playing experiences, transformation can be a state that alters a person's view of themselves, of others, or of the world in significant ways. It could be a state that shifts the way that we relate to other people interpersonally. Or it could be a state that has the potential to shift social dynamics and cultural dynamics in ways that build towards greater awareness, peace, and justice for all people. So this is a very lofty goal. This is more likely, right? But this is one of the things that we're studying in this LARPocracy project. Can we actually affect, even just affecting if a person feels that they can democratically engage in the world is remarkable. But obviously, can we actually, through LARP communities, for example, a lot of you are LARPers here, the community itself can be a transformative space, even outside of the games. And how does that then transfer into some sort of behavior as a group? Okay, so going to this concept of transformation as a prolonged and sustained state of change. So this state of consciousness has lasting after effects, and that happen long after the game has concluded. So it could be how they view themselves, our identities. So maybe feeling more confident or feeling, finding a part of yourself that you didn't know existed. How the player views reality, so their paradigm. This is really important in thinking about political science and other kinds of ways of understanding reality. How the player views others and interacts with them, so their relationships with other people. So, for example, people will use LARPs as a space to practice flirting in a way that feels safer than maybe they didn't outside in the world. And maybe they've built confidence in doing that through the game, consensually, hopefully. And then how the player views society, including its structures, their place within those structures, and how others have roles within them. So social structures like games are able to create systems for us to explore. So understanding one's place in a hierarchy, for example, or understanding how different parts of an organization work with one another can be explored. And then also how the player views cultures, subcultures, and even countercultural movements. Yes?
Because I see, obviously, the difference between just going out of character and having this prolonged and sustained state of change. But I've also observed that, especially after the long games, I mean, when you play the same character for 2-3 days without a break, for a few hours or even days, you get certain mannerisms, like you speak a certain way, you move in a certain way, like you basically change. So, but after a few weeks, it usually, hopefully, goes away. So, my
Unless
question
you
is,
want to change, then hopefully it would stay, but yeah.
where do you draw the line between what is still short, and when it becomes the transformation.
Yeah. So it's here how a player views themselves long term. So after, I call that the bleed window, which is usually between 24 and 36 hours intensely, but as you said, sometimes it can be months to get a LARP out of your system. But part of that is this reckoning with whatever you've experienced. And if that reckoning in some way changes you, then that would be a prolonged and sustained state of change. So it's not that you are still the character or acting as the character. It's more that something about that experience may have nothing to do with the character. It might have been something you witnessed. You saw two people get married and you thought that was profound and it actually changed your view of marriage. Like, who knows? You know, random things like that happen in LARPs and in tabletop as well. It's part of the exciting thing is you can design for transformative impacts, but then people get something completely different from what you intended. So I would say it fundamentally shifts a part of the way a person experiences reality. And it should be significant. I mean, I've played lots and lots and lots of role-playing games that didn't change me significantly. They were super fun. I had a great time. Sometimes feelings of joy and bliss can be, if you remember them fondly, that could be a form of transformation. Like, for example, I've played completely ridiculous role-playing games that themselves were not very interesting or meaningful, but the act of being with my friends and laughing, I can still remember how that felt, you know, that sort of joy. So it can be anything, really. I'm just giving some ideas here. As Janaea Kemper puts it, role-playing games allow us to weird the self. This term comes from British mythology, so becoming weird, becoming like magical in a way, basically. So we can consciously transmute our identities through intentional play. This is called steering, meaning we can be role-playing, but as ourselves, we can steer towards certain kinds of transformative experiences. So if I know for a fact that I have some sort of phobia about marriage, and I'd steer towards going to the marriage ceremony anyway, then I'm putting myself in a situation where I'm going to confront the thing that I have a phobia around, for example. So our view of transformation is inherently progressive, meaning that we are not interested in LARPs or tabletop role-playing games that are there to reinforce reactionary ways of being or exclusionary ways of being. We're interested in using role-playing games as a medium to help people progress from one state of another that's more beneficial both to them and to society as a whole. Commit to processes of change that are necessary for their own personal and social growth, work to reduce suffering in themselves and in others, to improve the overall well-being of the group, align with their sense of purpose, meaning, and authenticity. So authenticity is challenging because we kind of shift depending on our social context, but what feels authentic to the person. Connect with other people in ways that builds confidence and trust in the hopes of renewing faith in the human capacity for care and support. I don't know about you, but these days this one's been real hard for me. So, you know, having really profound role-playing experiences that renew our faith in humanity, that can be really powerful. And the role-playing experiences themselves may not be on these themes. They may actually be very, you know, intense, even oppressive dynamics. But the conditions of care around the group might be transformative. Therefore, role-playing games hold the potential to provide a vehicle for change processes to occur for all participants, including the designers and facilitators. So it's not just players that have the potential to experience this. So any activity, including leisure role-playing games, can be either educational or therapeutic in some way. This is often accidentally or as a side effect of participation. Like you go to a LARP about Cthulhu and you learned something about your phobia. You know, like maybe that wasn't the point of the game, but it just sort of accidentally happened. Some participants, however, may be primed for transformation based on what is happening in their lives, and the role-playing experience acts as a catalyst for that. So basically, maybe you've been working on this with your therapist for quite some time. You've actually been processing this for the last year, talking about how you have this phobia of marriage, and then all of a sudden you're at the LARP and you're in the scene and something just moves that was not movable before. There was some sort of block there. And all of a sudden you have this shift afterwards. So the LARP didn't change you, but it created an environment for transformation to happen. And then one of your instructors here, Mochatsky, I'd argue LARP doesn't transform people, it opens for transformation. A well-designed game can be a great beginning, but no more than a beginning. It has to be followed either with more role plays in order to make it a repeated, not a single experience, or with equally well-designed reflective and creative activities. So even if you're designing leisure LARPs, you can integrate a lot of the things that we're talking about to make transformation more likely to happen. So we actually further distinguish between leisure, educational, and therapeutic role-playing games. Leisure role-playing games are designed and played for a variety of reasons, mostly very personal and very individualized. Even if the game had a very specific goal in mind, people are coming for their own reasons. And it's usually voluntary in one's free time. So maybe somebody's not that excited about this theme, but they go because all their friends are going, right? And they end up there. We're interested in leisure transformational games. So games that are very clearly intended for a specific purpose, like we are going to learn about refugees through this LARP, and with the goal of developing more empathy or practicing ways to actually be of care, be of service, or give aid. Like that's a very specific learning objective. There's plenty of LARPs about refugees, but having that aim and being really clear with your players that that's what's happening makes it the difference between a transformative leisure and a leisure LARP or tabletop. And then there's educational games. These can be played in a variety of different settings. Could be formal, like this is a formal learning setting. Could be non-formal, like a museum or other kinds of community spaces. Or it could be completely informal, like just hanging out with friends. It may be voluntary, but often it's mandatory. So for example, classrooms during school time. And these have educational goals called learning objectives. So usually it's an extremely specific thing, like you are going to learn about the refugee crisis of this specific year and this specific time, right? Like maybe that's really important to the curricular goals of the class. And so that's the emphasis here. In which case it probably would need to have design that is suited towards that or framing that is suited towards that. And this is one of the constraints when working within formal education is how to fit it into the existing curriculum often. And then there's therapeutic role-playing games. So as I mentioned before, like with my random marriage example that I just made up, that could be potentially therapeutic for a person, but the game wasn't intended for that, and there wasn't a licensed or mental health professional or paraprofessional that was guiding the process and providing processing before and after. So there are therapists who run games that are leisure games, but if somebody has a therapeutic relationship with the participants, that's a client relationship, that actually changes the dynamics. And there's more of an expectation of processing and care surrounding the game. That being said, there are also social skills therapeutic games that like D&D where there isn't a ton of processing happening, but it is expected that maybe we might pause and talk about our feelings, which for, the average adolescent is actually not a very comfortable experience, but is actually more possible because of the game framework. And therapeutic may be voluntary, but it is sometimes mandatory. For example, if it's required by parents or the school or court system. There may be a crossover between these types of games, like a leisure LARP having on-site support from a psychotherapist, or a therapeutic LARP that also, as I said, guides participants to learn social skills or emotional intelligence. Okay. So applied role-playing games. We've talked about this a lot before. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically there's a lot of different settings: professional, educational, crisis management, healthcare, community outreach. For example, graduate students from the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution can role-play peace builders who provide aid during a civil war in a simulation that's designed by the Forge Center. So simulation is a lot of times very, very similar to something like LARP, but oftentimes it's not necessarily deep role-playing. Although I've been learning about what they do at the Forge Center, and they put this structure up on the wall that looks exactly like a LARP schedule. We're like, yep, you're LARPing. He's like, are we LARPing? I'm like, yeah, you are. So these applied goals often can relate to us in different levels. So it could be the personal level, it could be relational, so between people, it could be structural, so what's happening within the social structures, or it could be cultural, so what's happening in the overall culture. And all of these aspects are things that are happening kind of at the same time for us. So you can actually take elements from the leisure activity and apply them in specific settings. Maybe, for example, gamification is a really common one. Taking, some sort of leveling structure and applying it to a classroom. It's not necessarily the most motivating, but it's one of these things that it often is done. Yeah, Duolingo maybe is. I think there's a lot of guilt tripping in Duolingo as well. Like there's some serious social pressure coming from that owl to keep playing the game. But role-playing games are flexible enough to train several skills at once, including multiple types of cognitive, affective, and behavioral learning. So these categories overlap, and I was talking to a cognitivist, a CBT person, and he was saying, that's all cognition. But anyway, the point is that cognitive is usually more of a intellectual process, affective is more of a feeling process, and behavioral is more of what you do and how you interact overall, although there's a lot of overlap. So some examples of the ways that role-playing game designers can innovate using role-playing game practices. They can add fantastical elements or other purely fictional contexts. They can develop characters and relationships between them and deepen. They can create more narrative complexity. They can introduce combat systems and boffer fighting. That's often very motivating for young people, especially. There's a lot of LARP done with children in Denmark that's boffer fighting, including mechanics that represent versus various physical, mental, or emotional phenomenon. Your average, I don't know if there's such a thing as an average simulation, but there are certain types of mechanics that are specific to role-playing games that can be imported into other forms, is the thing here. You can have more immersive setting, costuming, and props. And you can also give players what are called affordances, so ways to, sort of permission to do a thing, to have more narrative agency outside of training one skill. So having meaningful choices, for example. The term edu-LARP, there is also edu-TTRPG or edu-RPG, so you'll hear it different ways, but edu-LARP specifically refers to LARPing. It describes many different live-action role-playing activities for students of all ages. So the term edu-LARP has been used to describe a peace demonstration LARP for a history class at the Danish boarding school, Østerskov Efterskole, which is taught almost entirely through edu-LARP. So there literally is a Hogwarts you can go and you can LARP at. There's a scientific game a science fiction game by Leif Rikstaden that is designed to help students practice English. So there's this organization in Sweden, a couple of them, that go to these schools and run these LARPs. So there's thousands of Swedish school children that have played these LARPs. There's a detective LARP by Seekers Unlimited, which I've studied actually, for a middle school science class in California. Actually, there's a series of LARPs. Or Prisoner for a Day. This is a LARP where Norwegian students were brought to a real prison from World War II to live a day in the life of prisoners to learn about human rights and history. So this is not a LARP you win. This isn't about defying the, taking over. This is about simply being in the experience. So using role-playing games in education can take many forms. You can play an existing RPG. We talked about that before. You can adapt it with educational structures, or you can design new ones. So here's some example for social science, physics, German as a foreign language, geography, drama. This is all the same designers. So it's a really great article by Katrin Genois. So basically what's happened is they have to look at the existing curriculum, they have to look at the learning objectives and see what kind of LARP would best suit that age group, their cognitive needs, their emotional needs, social needs, and the curriculum. All right, but does it work? What kind of empirical studies have been conducted on the benefits of RPGs? So we do not have a standard way to test RPGs. That's one of the things that we're kind of playing around with in this LARPocracy project is like, can we think of some measurements that are likely to always be the case, like perspective taking and empathy? Generally, role-playing games just kind of does that. To what degree, we don't know. And to what degree it's the LARP or something else, we don't know. But there are actually quite a bit of different studies and different skills that have been mentioned. So I'm going to read them very quickly. But on the cognitive domain, the important thing here is that given the right design, as I said, you could use it to teach anything, and often you can actually teach multiple skills at once. So for example, you might be having a very motivating scenario that involves critical thinking and also decision making, right? So you can do multiple things at once here. So perceived competence, feeling successful, capable, having agency, having self-efficacy, being engaged with school, motivation or self-determination, so feeling like you have an internal desire to do a thing, creativity or creative thinking, imagination or imaginative potential, critical thinking, decision-making skills, complex problem solving. Also in the cognitive domain, finding meaning, exploring character arcs different from one's own life story and one's own life challenges, experiencing self-reflection, moral development, subject matter revision, perspective taking, working with subject matter in a game, complex reflection about oneself, and complex reflection about teamwork or group dynamics. Affective domain, that's the emotional domain. Experiencing agency or empowerment, empathy, identity development, exploration or experimentation. This one is very common. Gender exploration or expression, identity reconstruction through a character, so being able to actually reconfigure who you are. Using it for stress or pressure relief, enhanced quality of life, personal development, emotional regulation, so being able to actually learn how to work with your emotions, processing trauma, having coping or adaptive skills that you can develop through play, expressing personal challenges, working through life difficulties without having to talk about them. This is one of the reasons that it works very well in certain kinds of therapy, because you'll have people that maybe have experienced something traumatic or embarrassing, and in therapeutic situations like group therapy, they're often expected to talk about it to everybody. You can actually approach things in a metaphoric way through games, or not approach them at all. Maybe you're not there to actually process that thing, you're there to learn how to make friends. And so just playing the game is actually therapeutic with other people. Experiencing trust in the group. Engaging in shadow work, so working with the unconscious parts that we don't always want to acknowledge. Games can sometimes be metaphors for our own internal struggles. Self-esteem, sense of accomplishment, feelings of belonging. This is a very important one. A lot of people who get into games maybe didn't feel a strong sense of belonging in other communities that they were in. Fulfilling needs, including social needs. Self-confidence, including learning how to be confident or coping when a mistake is made. Social confidence, lowering of perceived stakes, and transfer of traits or skills from the character to the player, which is what we're oftentimes looking for when we're designing for transformative play. And then we have the behavioral domain, so practicing pro-social skills, practicing social skills without serious repercussions for making mistakes. That can be really important. Some people might have, like, I've found in my studies, some people might have a golden moment, like their best part of a LARP when they were being humiliated socially. I'm like, okay. It's like something was being moved there that had, it wasn't them personally that were experiencing this repercussion, right? Freedom as stress relief from social mores, to explore relationships. So freedom, experiencing freedom. Improved social interactions or relationships with others. Group consensus building. This is really important for democracy. And as I mentioned, there's going to be a LARP tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about trying to build consensus through that LARP. Balancing self-interest with community responsibility. Connecting despite differences. Debate and persuasion. Conflict management or resolution or transformation, depending on how you view it. They have different kinds of techniques for all three of those. Practicing democratic skills, collaboration, confrontation, standing up to a bully. Some people have massively transformative moments through play, being able to do that, especially if they didn't feel like they could do that in their life before. Self-advocacy, so being able to state one's boundaries, for example, or to advocate for oneself, maybe to be the leader of the group. Group development, camaraderie, social cohesion, connectedness, friendship development, new social connections, development of what are called affinity groups, so groups who are clustered around the same kinds of affinities, things that they like. Development of social support networks, and confidence and boundary setting, as I mentioned. Team building, cooperation, communication skills, social emotional learning, decreased impulsivity, and then making active changes afterwards. So this is a lot, I know, but it gives you an idea of the wide range of things you could potentially design towards, and there's many, many more, right? So knowing that this literature exists can help you go and see what did they use, what surveys did they use, what problems did their method have that maybe I could in my study or in my implementation address, etc. Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that most of these studies focus on LARPs specifically, not on tabletop RPGs? And is there a difference, or are those things transferable between those two?
That's a great question. Almost all of this actually is role-playing, is tabletop literature, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
I mean, we do have LARP stuff, but it's and some of it's in here, but the vast majority of this is about D&D.
Whoa, okay. I got
Which is-
totally different standpoint from RPG. Standing from RPG, they say they only study LARPs, not RPGs. That's quite
No,
interesting.
actually, the vast majority of the literature right now is about D&D, and it's exploding right now because a bunch of people started playing during the pandemic, or have gotten involved because of Critical Role, and because of that, they're experiencing these amazing things, and then. For whatever reason, we had almost nothing, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's just a ton of stuff coming out, and it's almost all D&D related. So I was drawn into a interview once with this person who's writing a book on indie role-playing games. We talked about last time, Powered by the Apocalypse and all those games. And he was like, so tell me why indie role-playing games are more transformative than traditional ones. And I'm like, they aren't. I mean, as far as we can tell, they're maybe equally so. There just isn't, hardly any of this is on indie LARP or indie tabletop.
But like things that are defined in this, like Bleed, Magic Circle, and other definitions, like, they didn't come from RPGs. They all come from LARP circles.
Technically, the Magic Circle came from game studies. Bleed came from LARP. Well, we're going to go into this in a second, but yeah, but they aren't separate. So that's another thing,
Mhm.
is that they used to be kind of, like in the 2000s, they were kind of isolated communities, but there really was already interaction going on, like around 2007. That's when the concept of Bleed actually happened. A tabletop designer was visiting the Nordics at Festival and gave a talk about Bleed, and from the U.S., Emily Care-Boss. And then it became popular in LARP circles, and it took several years, but now it's actually in Vampire the Masquerade. There's a whole section on Bleed in the tabletop book. So the landscape is changing, let's just put it that way. But we also have things like creative agendas as a concept, which comes from tabletop that then gets used in LARP. So, yeah.
It's actually a comment, not a question, but I promise it will be short.
Breaking the rules.
And I will shame myself later, I promise. But actually, in every article that tries to be scientific about LARPs, author always, almost always makes this openly. If they believe that RPGs and LARPs are the same, so they will be using the literature, or on the contrary, that they're so different that they will not. So it's still like these two different approaches if these studies are actually possible to transfer. And there's a question. How do you think? Is it really like when we study tabletop RPGs in which you sit and talk about the characters, is it transferable to research about LARPs where you are the character?
In short, yes. I do think that embodied learning somatically has a different quality, but I also think we're always embodying to some extent. Even when we're sitting around the table, we're still feeling the feelings of our character, you know? And so I think that I know some people that really need that physical part to get there, but that doesn't mean that you can't get there in a more even online space. Like most of my transformative role playing has taken place over play by post forum, where there's no physical embodiment at all. We can't even see each other. So, you know, I think these are more like functions of the mind that in these certain contexts can be activated and improved. But that doesn't mean that we should assume all designs are the same or that all affordances are the same, and we should carefully consider those things. But we should also be aware that this stuff might be happening anyway, even if the game isn't good.
So I can't help but notice that most of those are post-pandemic. I mean, I would say like a half, so that's a lot. Is there any place in the world and university where there's more research on games going on? Or like, you know, should I read a certain scientist if I want to learn more on that? Because I'm interested in a lot of the psychological stuff, because I'm a psychology major. I'm here because I like LARPing, not because I study it. And I would like to know if there is any merit to therapeutic role-playing, because I would say I'm very, very, very skeptical. I mean, I can see the therapeutic work happening accidentally more than a professional making it happen on purpose. So
in terms of the therapeutic effects, there is several groups in the U.S. that are developing curriculum and training for how to do this, and it's specifically around tabletop. There are also some folks more on this side of things. I'm sure there are also tabletop therapists over here, but you know, a lot of the LARP research is happening here in Europe. But the important thing is that, yes, it absolutely can be designed for, and it's all about the container. And we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Yeah. But even if it's designed for, accidental things still might happen that are not planned. Another hand, two other hands. Let's see how much time.
Yes, sorry, hello.
No worries.
I wanted to ask, because you've mentioned that most of this research about the effects of role-playing games have been done on the D&D system. My question is, have there been any tests done to see if systems that maybe orient more around the character itself, say Call of Cthulhu, have different effects on these changes, maybe stronger in some areas than the others?
No, and I think that's definitely where we need to go with this research, especially from a design perspective. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. I think that there has to be some sort of difference between D&D and Cthulhu, for example, because you're so constrained in Cthulhu of what you can do. Your character is like so weak, purposefully, right? And so, but that doesn't mean you're still, I mean, you're either way, you're doing perspective taking and empathy, right?
For example, Cthulhu has built-in mental illnesses as well, so
Right.
perhaps it could be used as a tool for someone to walk through those illnesses that they might be dealing with
Right.
themselves.
Right. So this is where knowledge of the field is really helpful, because you can say, okay, what if we used Cthulhu in this very particular way, because it already has baked into it exploration of mental well-being. Problem is, a lot of those representations are not very sensitive, so it gets into tricky territory when you're using it. Sometimes you have to do a lot of adaptations.
I was curious about, like, in a therapeutic context, the effects of, for example, role-playing. How much can be, like, how much of it can be considered, like, actually integrating, like, the character or the traits that you're portraying? How much of them are actually integrated into a person, and to which extent maybe a person simply feels like they're putting on a role even when they use or portray these traits outside of a role-playing context?
That's a really good question, because transformation doesn't require the person who's transformed to acknowledge it. Meaning, sometimes other people can clearly see that you've transformed, but you may not be able to see it so much, right? There is some literature where there's, like, for example, there's this article about Dagahir by Matthew McClare, which is Boffer LARP in the U.S., and there's people talking about another participant in the study saying he has clearly grown in his leadership capabilities, but the participant doesn't see it for himself, right? So it's complicated, but in terms of integration, I would say let's just put it this way: it's better if it's a conscious process, right? It's probably going to be it's better to be conscious in general in life, but if it happens unconsciously, that's also great too, if it's a positive thing. Okay, excellent. A lot of excitement around the empirical studies. That makes me happy. Okay, speaking of empirical studies, so I don't know how much of the actual study I put in here, but we are attempting to do longitudinal studies on our LARP the Assembly. This was designed for a Horizon Europe project where we study LARP and its potential impacts on democracy or ways to facilitate LARPs or LARP communities that are inherently democratic or more democratic. The players play participants in a democratic deliberation. They're listening to each other. They're exchanging reasons. They're willing to open up and potentially be wrong or change their mind. And they're from very different walks of life. So what we did is we took these benefits that we just talked about, and then we took the empirical benefits of deliberative events, which are real things that happen in the world and are very closely studied by a very small little group of political scientists, as I understand it. It's not a super widespread. And then we sort of collectively made some learning objectives for deliberative LARP design. So if you want to design specifically for this purpose, here are some learning objectives. And there's quite a bit of overlap between deliberative events and LARP in terms of the impacts. And the reason is probably in part because it's facilitated, it's designed, it's structured, and yeah. So we came up with 5 categories. The first is applying basic knowledges and skills. So improving factual or political knowledge of an issue or a political system, including systems thinking. And this primary domain is cognitive. Improved deliberative skills, such as giving an argument and listening, problem solving. Here, arguing doesn't mean arguing with somebody or debating them. It means providing a reasoned argument. Those reasons don't have to be intellectual. They can be emotional or personal. but it's a reason. And that's both cognitive and behavioral. And then we have forming and communicating opinions, so improved understanding and consistency of participants' own considerations, so their own, what they consider when they're considering an issue, moral reflection. Its primary domain is cognitive. Improved intrinsic motivation, self-determination. This is one of the things that I do in all my studies. I don't have a ton, but I'm trying to get more into quantitative research. I'm really interested in intrinsic motivation. And actually, one of the sort of fathers of this theory just died a couple months ago, so I was reading about him. Intrinsic motivation, empowerment and or agency, and in political science, internal or external efficacy. So specifically, does a person feel like they can have an impact if they participate politically, and do they feel like the world will respond to their participation? And this we kind of put under cognitive, affective, and behavioral. Listening to and understanding others, so understanding their considerations, taking perspective and empathy, cognitive and affective. Understanding how to reconcile the values and the interests of others. So we don't always align. Like, I don't know if you remember the character sheet from before, but she's not necessarily a very coherent person. She's got all sorts of things going on that may or may not have anything to do with her actual political beliefs. And so when we try to deliberate, we have the opportunity to actually reconcile what our values are, what our positions are, and what our interests are, like so that they're more aligned. And so having a deliberative space with other people can help us do that. Cognitive and affective. Developing group cohesion. So what's super interesting from my perspective as a LARP scholar is that the same kinds of things that happen in deliberative events happen in LARPs, which is the development of a group identity and community building. So when I wrote my book, I assumed somehow that there would be a type of LARPer. And my participants came from so many different walks of life, political beliefs, everything. And I will say that in retrospect, most of them were probably neurodiverse, but I didn't know that word yet. But they were really interested in a lot of things. Like, you know, that was like the one shared thing, right, is that they get really interested in certain things. But the important thing here is that even if you have different group affiliations outside of the game, when you're together, it creates a group affiliation within the game. And this develops over time through play. And it also happens in deliberative events. And then development of the norm formation of the group. So what are our norms within this? We do this very consciously when we talk about safety mechanics, for example, or we describe what the rules of engagement are. Yeah.
Just to make sure, you mean the group identity of the characters or the group identity of the players saying, yes, we the ones who played this game?
Both. So this is challenging because LARPers like drama. And so one of our design considerations is how are we going to get high drama LARPers to deliberate, which is relatively boring and not very intense. How do we get them to emotionally regulate and like just listen instead of going straight to the most intense kind of reaction that they could possibly have, which will be more cathartic and fun. And so we have to actually give very explicit instructions. So I honestly don't know the degree to which, and this is one of the things that we'll maybe find out in the interviews, maybe it's a good question to ask them actually, is did you feel like you were part of a group as your character? I think as players during the debrief, for the most part, everybody seems, at least they were sharing very openly. And that's a good sign that maybe they feel like they're part of a group. But the characters, some of them were very angsty at the end of the LARP still, and maybe even more polarized, which is what it's not supposed to do. But that's also interesting, right? Deliberative events also have that problem sometimes. They don't always work. And then this is what we're hoping to see, of course, integration of transformative impacts, so impacting their political beliefs or worldview after the event, or impacting their motivation to engage and or actually to engage in political behavior in the outside world after the event, either as a group or individually. All right. Any questions on the learning objectives? So this is an example of taking that empirical evidence and trying to apply it to design in very conscientious ways. So going to that theory that we talked about, how can we maximize the potential for transformation? Can I have a time check, just so I have a sense of where we're at? Great. So regardless of the type of transformative role-playing games, and also the genre, key to success for any transformative process is reflection and processing, or our reflection and processing. Debriefing is one of the ways, as we talked about, but also those integration practices we mentioned last time. So creative expression, community building, there's lots of different ways that people can integrate. Goal setting, like for ahead of time, like with these learning objectives, can also be very helpful, but we should keep in mind that games are unpredictable in their impacts as a result of emergent play. Also, some people just might not change. You know, you can't predict it. Intentionality at all stages, design, implementation, and play, can help the group steer towards these transformative impacts, but it can't guarantee them. I'm not going to go too into depth into safety here, but the perception of safety is important to establish and maintain in role-playing communities. If you want to learn more about this, we do have one textbook out and another one coming out. One's on design and one's on implementation. I can tell you about later. But basically, there's entire chapters on this topic. Safety allows people to lower their vigilance and surrender more deeply to playfulness as a central part of the transformative process. When I say surrender deeply, I don't mean go into a trance and let anybody do whatever they want to you, right? Like it's more like building enough trust within the group to feel like your needs will be tended to, hopefully, and you can kind of relax this inner vigilance that we often have when we're in social situations. Like, for example, giving a lecture, very high vigilance kind of state, at least for me. Safety necessitates enthusiastic consent, the ability to opt in and opt out, as well as calibration, so being able to negotiate with each other, and other forms of negotiation and self-advocacy. Now, notice I said perception of safety. The reason I said this is because there is no such thing as a safe game. There is no such thing as a safe space. There are safer spaces that are designed with intention so that people feel more safe. It's a perception. But at any point, somebody could hurt somebody. I mean, that's just the case. At any point, someone could get triggered and could have a really bad experience. Ideally, the structure surrounding the game is supportive enough to catch them when that happens. So this is our model, and some of the terms that you mentioned earlier are here. So a lot of these aspects are true of any game, but here we're envisioning role-playing games as specifically as a transformational container. So if we wanted to build it to maximize those impacts, how would we do that? So you have yourself, your daily identity, and that self is given alibi, so given fiction and given a character. And here, if you notice, the alibi is actually quite thin up at the top. The reason for that is role-playing games can be, you can play a very close-to-home character or a far-from-home character. Sometimes you can't say for sure that close-to-home will be more transformative, like sometimes far-from-home is super transformative. But the point is that we are acknowledging that we are bringing in parts of ourselves into this game. And this is something the therapists are really good at. They have debriefing questions like that are specific to the character if it's a behavior they don't want to foster. Like, why did your character threaten to kill the guard, you know? Or they have things that are directed at the player if it's a behavior they want to foster. So it was really incredible the way you you know, went and slayed that dragon or whatever. Like, that was so brave. Yeah, well, that's humans. Everything is persuasion. Persuasion. Manipulation is like gaslighting, you know, or like lying. Yeah. But persuasion is a gentle way of saying it. You know, that's why when we talk about everything as a designable surface, in some ways we're talking about social engineering and persuasion, right? How do you persuade people to feel safe in a space? I mean, the important thing is that you actually mean it. Manipulation is when you don't mean it. Seduction often is when you don't mean it. It's like there's some sort of trick happening, whereas everything is persuasion in some way, including this lecture. And so in transformative play, you have goals, you have agreements. Ideally, you have transparency. Some of the games that have caused some harm have been non-transparent games, where people didn't realize that they were in a transformative experience that was designed for them. Consent and safety structures, and this community support. So the social contract here is actually quite strong. There's a lot of expectation of the players to care for each other. The magic circle of play is everything that kind of happens within the context of the game. You play an alter ego, and things inevitably do bleed in, even if you don't notice them. So this is one of the concepts Hugo talks about, the bleed perception threshold. Like, bleed is always happening. There's spoiler alert, there's no self versus character that's this very distinct thing, right? Like, there's always stuff that we're bringing in, even if the character is really very different than ourselves. But there's also intentionality. Like, maybe you specifically want to work with this particular character trait that you don't like about yourself, and you want to magnify that. And you have the intention to do that with the character. And then there's also playfulness, which doesn't always feel playful. Going to be in the prison LARP is probably not a very playful experience, but you know, you're agreeing to be in this playful state. Type 2 fun, exactly. And then you play this quote-unquote character. I put those things in quotes, just like I put self in quotes, because to me, it's always me on some level. But then you bleed out in some way. It doesn't always, it's not, like I said, it's not always conscious, but there often can be mechanisms that can allow that to be more likely to happen. Bleed is not good or bad, but it's as we're going to see, it's a mechanism. It's something that we can work with. And then transfer so bleed is more of an unconscious process. Like, if you can't stop crying for 3 days, that's not a conscious thing. That's just your psyche is doing something. It's processing through a thing. But if you're intentionally taking something from that experience, like, I really want to work on this loneliness that I have and this core belief about myself that I'm unlovable, and so then you take that to therapy, then that's a transfer, right? Some people never get to that point. A lot of people don't get to that point. And then the transformation gets blocked because it gets bounded into the space. So it's one of the reasons we like the alibi to be thin. It's like, okay, what's happening out here? And what does it say about us and what our needs are? So we still have goals, but we also have processing and reflection of the experience, and ideally taking action in some way. Like I said, going to therapy is an example. Like, it's not just, oh, I need to work on myself, but I'm going to not do that. It's like, I'm going to be in a process of change that involves going to therapy after this LARP. And this LARP was just one little part of that longer process. And then again, safety structures and community support. And then integration in some way. So the self has changed, ideally into something that feels more authentic than the suit self. Unless you're really into being a suit self.
Can you develop a little bit more on the difference between alter ego and character?
Basically, an alter ego can happen outside of a game. So a character is a thing that happens in the game. An alter ego might be a part of yourself that comes through the character.
I'll take that. And maybe to follow up on these points, because they kind of maybe let me rephrase that. Are any of those unique to the educational and transformational approach to game design, beside the intention maybe?
Intentionality, goals, agreements and transparency around those goals. Like, you're not just here to have fun. You're not just here to hang out with your friends. You're here to practice a skill, you know? Some people will just opt out if they're told this is an educational game, and that's fine, right? You don't want people there who don't want to be there. You want people who are already primed for transformation, that are ready to, that are open to potentially having an experience that could change them. And then transfer, so that real intentionality about what we're taking with us from the experience. So you mentioned de-rolling a little while ago. Often in LARP we have this de-rolling process of what do you want to leave with you, what do you want to take, or what do you want to leave behind, what do you want to take with you? So that's usually just this kind of quick ritual that kind of, you know, helps you distinguish between self and character, but I like that to be the whole debrief, basically. Like, let's really think about this. What do I want to take with me about this experience? What do I want to leave behind?
Okay, I had a question, because I assume that most of this is for the players themselves when they, are the characters. But for example, for the tabletops, you also have the role of the dungeon master.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is that perhaps too much responsibility on the dungeon master to lead a group of 5 people through emotional transformation through potentially many weeks or months even?
I wouldn't say it's too much responsibility, but it is a lot of responsibility, and people should undertake that very carefully, for sure. But I think that's true of running any game, to be honest, because if you think that your players are not going to transform, they do that. They just do that unintentionally a lot of the times. And if the safety structures and like, for example, I started doing this work because I had my own experiences of not being held by the community I was in. People tried, but nobody had the language. None of this. We didn't have any of these words to describe what we were doing. And so the alibi was such a hard line that it was a taboo to talk about anything that was happening to the player as a result of what's going on in the game. And so this is a different way of thinking about that, where it's normalized. But yes, it's a lot of responsibility, absolutely.
I have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is about the bleed, because you say that this is the mechanism that always happens.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you then have different set of terms for this kind of bleed that is actually very negative. Like, for example, when you argued with a person so you don't like them in real world later, like this transition that shouldn't be happening, like, or when you don't like somebody so your character will not like their character even if they should be close allies.
Mm-hmm.
So how to differentiate then if it's different?
We don't. We would call both of those things probably relationship bleed, which is on the next slide. Or it says romantic here. We've changed this. This is just one form of relationship bleed. These are old slides. But basically, in both cases, those are relationships. They're aspects of the self, right, that are in the relationship with the other that is affecting off-game or in-game. The difference is how we work with it. Do we allow it to just be negative and just hate that person? Or do we go up to them and saying, I'm having this weird, it's called in the literature, antipathy. I'm having this antipathy towards you. And I would love to just sit down and have a coffee as humans and reconnect with you as a person so that I don't keep feeling this way towards you, you know? So I have a paper about this that goes into many, many, many examples of ways in which bleed can cause problems in communities. But I don't think bleed is a problem itself. It's more like, how do we handle it? Do we have the resources to actually be able to deal with it?
And the second question is about the transparency of the design, because is it necessary for the players to know that they are taking part in the educational experience? For example, if you design I don't know, LARP with different groups, which is actually, the idea is to teach about the tolerance, about the learning despite differences and so on, but you communicate to the players only this leisure level of the experience.
If you're expecting and hoping that they will change as a person permanently, then it's probably good to communicate that in some way. Otherwise, they may feel betrayed. And this has happened at games that were intended to have a certain educational impact, and people played for 3 days super hard and they didn't realize they were playing someone's EduLARP, and then they had this like gotcha documentary that was played at the end to see, this is what you were really playing, you know. That feels awful, right? So like you mentioned different target groups. You might say, maybe you say tolerance to the oldest, but for the young ones you say, we're going to learn how to get along better and to understand that we're, even if we're different, we're still friends, like, or something, right? But you're still communicating the goal of the game.
So my question is about the how do we foster a community that allows this sort of conversation? I don't know if all of the LARPing communities, and I would say we have the whole community and then we have our little groups, and those are our little communities. I'm not sure if with all of those groups I would feel comfortable coming up to a player I have a bleed with. How do you foster a community that allows for this sort of open communication? How do you deal with players who have a tendency for toxic behaviors? Do you exclude them? Do you try to teach them? How would you deal with that? How would you say we build those communities?
We have a whole class on this in the master's program you might be interested in. We have an online master's program on transformative game design based on this. It's you can take it from anywhere in the world. And we also have a book coming out that deals with a lot of this in the safety chapter. But in short, you talk about it. You say, there's this thing called bleed. You may feel very, very intense emotions after this LARP. That is normal. And we encourage you to talk to each other about it. So a lot of it is the community design, what we talked about, the social contract. The norm in this community is that we talk about our feelings after the LARP. So intentional community design, it's also a form of alibi in a way. It's like, well, the designer told me I'm supposed to talk to you if I'm feeling bleed. I'm a little awkward right now, but do you mind if we have a conversation, you know? Practicing, so doing embodied workshops where they practice calibrating with each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't play in communities like this at all. You know, and bleed was out of control, especially in vampire LARPs. And so that's why I started studying this stuff, because I'm like, there's so much potential here. How do we do it better? So let me just go over the types of bleed really quickly so that you have like a lay of the land. As I mentioned, Emily Care-Boss came up with the topic, came up with bleed as a concept, but she was mostly talking about emotional bleed, and that's the one that's most obvious to us, I think, because we feel it so strongly. Negative experiences leading to animosity between players, yes. Or just happen to fall in love with the same person every time you play different characters. Like, that's me and my husband. Such an accident. Procedural bleed, so where physical abilities, traits, habits, and maybe bodily or physical states bleed. So you were talking about speaking like the character. That's this procedural part. Things that you don't even realize you're doing, like affectations or ways that you hold your body. So tics, movements, reflexes, learning to move in a way that physically exudes more sensuality, for example. Maybe your character does this a lot, and so then you do this a lot, you know, and you don't, like, whoa, that's not something I ever did before. Mimetic bleed, so where ideas, thoughts, opinions, convictions, ideology bleeds between player and character. This is what we're interested in part, in the assembly. Yes, but also, so there's this concept called LARP democracy that you often don't want to happen, which is if you want to play a game about oppression, if they all like overthrow the system right away, it's like, that's not what we were playing here. But we're actually like, thinking, what if we could do LARP democracy well, right? And we actually are practicing not just how to overthrow the system, but how to like create a functional system afterwards, for example. That could be really awesome. So for example, values of equity and equality that are embedded in a structure into the game, and that leading to players adopting these views outside of the game. So you asked about like intentional community creation. That's the kind of thing that can be a form of mimetic bleed. Either whether it's practiced through the play community or it's specifically if it's practiced through game. Ego bleed, this is when aspects of your personality and your identity bleed between player and character. I'm not giving you names for this, but I'm happy to give you slides or point you to the relevant literature afterwards just because we're running low on time. But basically, archetypal contents can sometimes bleed over and interact with your personality, or just more sort of basic personality traits. Emancipatory bleed, so this is an experience when people from marginalized backgrounds experience a feeling of liberation through their characters. This can be steered towards these liberatory experiences as a means to challenge structural oppression. And this is work by Janaea Kemper. So for example, overthrowing an oppressive structure, as we talked about, that can actually lead players to process aspects of their real life oppression in their own lives. So we shouldn't necessarily think the LARP democracy is a bad thing, even if it destroyed this beautiful, storyline. And then romantic bleed, when people feel attracted or even fall in love with fictional characters or their players after a role-play experience. So some people will fall in love with the character and then the character no longer exists, and then others will start having feelings for the player. But it also can be other kinds of relationships, as we mentioned before. And then identity, these things can overlap. They can affect each other in complex ways. Any questions on bleed? We've all got it. Great. So, bleed is not always transformational. This is going back to what you were kind of alluding to, I think. Some people experience it as very negative and damaging, and others do not experience it at all, which can feel also negative in a way, like everybody else is crying and hugging each other, and you're like, it was nice, And then others deal with integration in other ways. Maybe they don't feel very strongly at all. They're more, intellectually analyzing the experience. Or maybe they didn't get much at all from the character, but they got something from the scenario itself. However, it offers these mechanisms that can help us understand pathways to transformation. We can become more aware of the frames of in-game and off-game. They're more porous than we think we are. So, for example, I've had experiences where all of a sudden I realize that my character doesn't have my anxiety disorder. That's interesting because that's something I very much associate with myself, with my identity. Like, I am an anxious person. But all of a sudden, maybe I cannot be an anxious person. That's scary because that means that, wait, I can actually get myself into another mind state under the right circumstances where I'm not experiencing that, which means that the responsibility is in part on me to be responsible for my emotional regulation. A lot of people don't want to realize that. They're like, no, it's just a game. Okay, cool. But it is quite interesting. Acknowledge this as a great potential for steering this porousness. Use it to unlock aspects of our life that we would like to design differently. Our identities, our self-concepts, our communities, our paradigms, relationships, etc. Some people discovered that they're polyamorous through play. Whoops. What do we do now? If they're in a monogamous relationship, right? Maybe they need a redesign of their relationship, or maybe they just need some other way to get their needs met in their relationship that may not have anything to do with romance. Sometimes let the bleed window settle, and you might realize that, oh, in that very specific context, as that character, I was poly, but I actually don't want that at all. Okay, cool. That's also important to learn. That's a transformative moment right there, right? Having tried something and discovered that your identity is something that you can have some control over and choice. Integrate our experiences in intentional ways, express ourselves in ways that feel more authentic as discovered through play. So Winnicott was super interesting. He believed that we needed to let children, very briefly, we needed to let children play because they would project their consciousness. We talked about this with imaginary friends, transitional objects. They project their consciousness onto reality, and that is because they believe that they are magical, and that's actually super important to their development. And when we tell them not to play, we're basically telling them, you're not that self. You don't have that capability. And they develop a false self. And so that's super profound for me because he talks about the authentic self and the false self. Those of us who keep playing in adulthood are actually defying that in a way and saying, no, I'm going to keep looking for who I really am. What's our time? Okay. We've already kind of been through ritual. I don't think we need to go too deep into it, except to say that there is a difference between liminal and liminoid experiences. So in ritual, you have this separation. I'll show you the diagram. State 1, you have the separation from that state, which is usually a social separation of some sort. So for example, think about a wedding ritual where, the men and the women separate, if it's super heteronormative, and, they get ready, especially the women. There's a lot of ritual activities associated with that preparatory phase for the liminality. Then they're in the wedding, they're in this liminal state where it's the bride and the groom. They're only going to be that for that 45-minute ceremony or however long it is, depending on your culture. And then after that liminal state, they reincorporate into a new state as a result. Now, as we mentioned, this is a rite of passage, so this is intended to be permanent. So rites of passage are socially condoned changes of identity. So when the bride becomes wife, that has a different social status than before and different norms around it. But not all rituals are liminal in the way that Turner is talking about it, which is these socially condoned things where you change socially afterwards. Some of them are liminoid, and these are things that we engage in for entertainment. They're optional. The group doesn't believe in the social truth of that reality afterwards. So this is one of the things people often get wrong about role-playing games. They're like, oh, you're losing touch with reality. It's like, no, we totally know the difference between reality and fantasy. This is not real. But that does mean that it can be hard to acknowledge actual transformation that happens because you're in this not real space. Victor Turner, who's the anthropologist who is one of the people who made popular this theory, he talked about how liminoid experiences in some ways are even cooler because they're voluntary. So it's an exercise of an individual's freedom, their growing self-mastery, even self-transcendence. They're imbued with pleasure, and maybe type 2 pleasure, but pleasure in ways that other expected activities such as work are not. And they are potentially capable of releasing creative powers, individual or communal, either to criticize or buttress the dominant social structural values. Like, this is pretty intense stuff. So subcultures, any of you have been involved in a musical subculture, or, they often have this sort of questioning. Role-playing games can lead to transformative experiences that are sometimes more profound than these widely sanctioned social rituals. That's super fascinating. I felt a lot more during my fake wizard school graduation than I did for other graduations. And I had those diplomas on the wall and not the other ones. Okay? It's not that her education was more important than mine, but it's more like, this is a wonderful memory I really want to think about, right? Like the ephemera of that, because we actually got diplomas. So supporting each other helps create a structure around this communitas. So everybody agrees that, this isn't real in the sense that this fiction isn't real, but we acknowledge that you might go through something big and change as a result of this, and we're going to hold you in that. I have one more slide I wanted to bring up because it's super important. We didn't get to conflict transformation. It's good stuff. Or motivational interviewing. Basically, change is complicated, and it's not a straight line. Resistance is not always a bad thing. It can also be part of the process. So, for example, you might have resistance to loss, resistance to letting go of someone or something important, including our feelings of control, resistance to intimacy, to opening up to others, potentially getting hurt, resistance to vulnerability, lowering our defense mechanisms that have kept us safe. There's a reason we might be scared of that, right? Identity, be resistant to any process that might invite us to question our sense of self, like, I'm not an anxious person, am I an anxious person? Now what, That's scary. Resistance to any process that might lead us to invite us to question our worldview, our paradigm. That is really hard. For example, maybe realizing that the religion you were raised in is not the religion you want to be in. That's scary. Status quo, resistance to any process that destabilizes our perception or disrupts our desire to keep living our lives the way we currently are. This is called homeostasis. And there's actually, Kjell Hedgard Hugos has been writing about how bleed takes us out of homeostasis. It is disruptive. The organism's like, SOS, like there's something wrong here, right? And so it makes sense that people would want to revert back to where they were before. But if they stick with it, it could be transformative. They might experience cognitive dissonance when it's hard to integrate ideas that are different from one's own, or the identity defense when they reject new information because it threatens their paradigm, or is perceived to be incompatible with their identity. This is a lot of Piaget, but the most important part is that we process information in different ways. We may reject it, we may try to convert it to the way we think, or we might actually undergo a transformative process. And it's a crisis-like situation where challenges are urgent and unavoidable. So that sounds hard and scary, right? Transformation is not always a beautiful thing. That's why we use the butterfly. The butterfly is not a pleasant state of transformation. Okay. Okay, this is the last part. So transformation should emphasize choosing to change or learning how to navigate a change that is inevitable. For example, using role-playing games, tabletop, with elderly folks that are transitioning out of life soon. That's helping them navigate, perhaps, a change that is inevitable, right? Ultimately, we should be able to choose the degree to which we face our own points of resistance. This is extremely important. So, resistance is hard, transformation is hard, and we shouldn't force it on people. And we shouldn't trick them. That's the whole thing about this. Well, do we have to tell them our learning objectives? Yes. You don't have to say it in those terms. You can say it in a different way, but let them know that you have an intention of creating a transformative space. And this is the same principle in psychology. Most psychological studies do not necessitate deception. You have to have a really good reason to deceive your subjects, and it has to be motivated. So it should always be consensual. We may not always be aware of these processes, but we should always be able to calibrate with others, self-advocate, hey, something's up. I don't know what's going on, but this feels weird all of a sudden. So, as we were talking about a second ago, a healthy role-playing community fosters safety, calibration, communication, self-advocacy. So, just saying it up front. And it discourages peer pressure on people to push past their boundaries, instead invites people to explore their edges for growth. This is different for everyone. Some people, just walking out the door is like a huge transformation. Some people are so scared that some very basic thing to one player is a huge thing for another player. But the important thing is we're not pushing people out into the unknown, into the scary parts, or the parts where they're so overwhelmed they can't completely, unless they ask for that. Sometimes they will. They'll be like, I don't want to think, I want you to just push. It's like, okay, but then you've calibrated that, right? All right. And then what types of transformation do you think might be possible in your work? It's just sort of an open question. Any other thoughts? Yeah? Yeah? Mike? I know, sorry.
Because we see that there are lots of positive outcomes of this transformation thing, but I was thinking about possible threats, maybe. I mean, for example, when you tend to play villains or negative characters, for example, I don't know, dominant, manipulative, violent, and so on, is it possible, I mean, probably it is possible since it can be subconscious to, you know, transform and maybe gain those negative traits like being more manipulative instead of, for example, more confident, which would be a positive trait. And does debriefing, is debriefing enough in this situation?
So those are both examples of ego bleed, right? Becoming more manipulative is also ego bleed, but it's explicitly not what we're looking for. Remember in the beginning we talked about progressive change. We're interested in change that benefits everybody, not just one person. So while those changes can happen, that's not what we're trying to foster here.
Yeah, but how to maybe stop it or fight it, like trying to avoid it? Like this bad transformation?
Debriefing is almost always my answer. I know in Vampire, a lot of this happens. There's actually a whole paper here. I don't have it here, but Beltran wrote 2 papers, one in 2012 and one in 2013 on shadow work, is the 2013 one. And she talks specifically about this and specifically about vampire role-playing because there's just this constant no de-rolling, no debriefing, immersion into the worst parts of ourselves. And that can be really powerful stuff. That can be so cool. You can learn so much. But if you don't have space to undergo that process, like even just to sit with someone and say, I can't believe I yelled at you in that way. That was not me. And it's confusing to me. Or, wow, I really liked that in a way I feel uncomfortable with. You know, like even just having space to say that makes a huge difference. Okay. But if it's not addressed, it can easily lead to interpersonal conflict and identity crisis, all sorts of things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about, I assume that you know the Zimbardo prison experiment. I wondered if this is something that you would actually classify as an attempt of LARP that backfired because of the too much bleed?
Well, it's whatever it was, it certainly backfired because of lack of safety. There was no understanding, I mean, this is a psychologist, there's no understanding about how trauma works, how roles, how easy it is for people in certain roles to behave in certain ways. There's a lot of myths around the Stanford Prison Experiment. We don't need to get into all of that, but you know, some people think it wasn't as intense as people say it was, you know, but whatever. The point is, they dropped students into a 2-week LARP without any preparation where they were abusing each other or being abused.
So would that be possible to do it in a safe way, like
Yes.
anyway?
Yes, but would it be advisable? It's high risk, especially when you already have a teacher-student dynamic. That's already a power dynamic there. And then you're asking them to be in this experiment and you want to be the cool, you know, kid who's going to, you know, do what the teacher says. And then you are in a situation where all of a sudden you're pushed back your boundaries and you don't want to ruin the experiment for your teacher. I mean, there's all sorts of high-risk things going on there.
A question on the main topic of these days. How do you see artificial intelligence influencing the studies or the thing? Do you think it might create options to have bigger scale for the studies, or maybe create designs that are aimed at one player playing with the artificial intelligence to achieve something? is there anything already going on? Do you have hopes for it, or do you want to push it as far into the future as possible? What's your take?
I think, in general, the LARP community is very hostile towards AI for good reason. We are a creative, often free, even we spend our own money to do this activity. And the idea that our creative labor is all of a sudden devalued even more than it already is really scary and really not cool. It's already hard enough to get people to pay their artists for the website logo or whatever. So there's hostility around that, and also the creative process, the fact that like, oh, well, the AI can write the character sheets. Yeah, but they're going to be shitty character sheets. I mean, you can use the AI as a starting point, but then but why not use your own brain? You know what I mean? Like there's do you need to design a LARP so complex that you need to use AI? I guess is my question. Now, what you were talking about in the beginning is super interesting because the press has started to talk about AI as role-playing with people who talk to it, which is really upsetting for me. But that's the way they're talking about it because the AI tries to figure out what you want to hear and adjusts itself. And so do I think that can be... so part of the problem is there's no magic circle in that situation. If you very intentionally use it within a place where you have created a social contract and all of that, then maybe. But if you're just interacting with the AI and it's role-playing with you indefinitely, that's the same problem as the vampire problem, except maybe even more insidious because you may start to believe it's real and it's feeding your ego. And there's a lot of people that are having suicidal thoughts or have killed themselves or are being encouraged to kill people by the AI. This is happening. So it's not a technology that is, and I'm specifically talking about generative AI here. There's lots of different kinds of AI. But I think that we don't know enough and the psychological risk is high. So I study people. Other people have been starting to look into LARP and AI. It's not my particular interest. Although one of the projects we have has a book called the Tech Toolkit that goes into some of the uses of AI in LARP and in tabletop. So, yeah. I think the most disturbing thing about AI is that it lies. And I'm, a teacher. I want truth to be, obviously truth is relative depending on where you're standing, but there are things that are facts and not facts. And I think that's important to maintain as an educator. So if Gen AI gets to a point where it stops lying to us, then maybe it might be useful. Where it stops being a sycophant, maybe. It's hard to say.
I have a simple question, maybe something fun. What would you say is your favorite system for this transformative type of games?
Kind of like I mentioned before, I don't know that I have a favorite system in terms of like this system is better at this than other systems. But I have favorite systems in terms of what the mechanics mean and what they encourage you to do. So in terms of traditional tabletop, Mage the Ascension is my favorite game because it's literally about learning how to shape reality with your will, which is a lot of what we do as role players. As we say, well, things are going to work differently for the next 3 hours here, So it's a really cool metaphor, I think, for the way that we can actually affect change. There's a lot of things that I just completely throw out of that game, though. There's a rule book this big. It's whatever. I just like the first 4 pages. But that's just me. I'm not a heavy mechanics person. It's still very cool stuff. It's just not my thing. Dream Askew is one of the games that I really like because it fosters pro-social behavior. So it's an apocalypse world game. So it's like, yeah, you're super cool. You're this awesome tiger or whatever, right? But if you want to do a cool thing and exert power over others, you lose a token. And if you want to gain a token back, you can be vulnerable with others. You can share a secret. You can comfort someone in their time of need. So it's this way that the designer is saying, yeah, cool, you can still do all that hardcore stuff, but actually it's much stronger in actuality to be vulnerable with others. And that's what actually reinforces our community. So yeah, I like that game a lot for a lot of reasons. It also shares, distributes power. So we were talking about the GM and a lot of responsibility, even narratively. Each person plays a significant NPC for another person, and they play parts of the world for each other.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Will be like coming back to a topic that I already asked. But, I struggle to like, because you mentioned that actually it may be worthy to check if different systems, for example, affect players differently, like Dungeons and Dragons versus, for example, Powered by the Apocalypse, because they're different in like from the mechanical point of view. So if we assume that different mechanics can already shape players differently, why can we assume that like RPGs on the table and LARPs shape them in the same way? Like why one difference is like significant and the other one can be omitted?
I mean, I think all of these are great research questions. You know, I just don't have a clear answer for you. I had my own assumptions, but the literature isn't reflecting those assumptions. I think that the process of role-playing, period, is transformational. Like just being able to step outside of yourself and experience something else for a while, and play with the rules of reality, whatever the system is, it can be transformational. So I think that it's not, we like to think, I think as designers specifically, people like to think, oh, I'm the puppet master. I know it's because I had this brilliant mechanic that you did that thing. It's like, okay, maybe. Or maybe they were just role-playing, and role-playing has this function, which is why I'm interested, okay, what's the baseline that it always does? It always does perspective taking on some level. That may also lead to empathy.
Follow-up question to this answer, because there are players that no matter what system and no matter what world and what kind of game will always just create the same character. Like always basically themselves in this world. One word it will be like, I don't know, a duchess, another it will be a CEO, but it's always the same archetype. Would you say that for such people who always plays the same archetype, the same person basically, it also always happens that they develop in the same way that people who play different archetypes, or would you make a distinction here?
That's a whole other talk about the different types of self and what is it, even a self, and you know. But I would say that a lot of the things that we listed have nothing to do with the character. You know, developing more self-advocacy. You can do that as yourself through the character. You know what I mean? So it doesn't have to necessarily be playing somebody very different than yourself in order to have that. Maybe, and I've done this before, playing the same person in different settings. So I've played my main vampire character in Vampire, then I played her as an NPC in Vampire, and then I played her in D&D. And the affordances of those spaces and the social, all the aspects, including my intentionality, were different. So I got to explore lots of aspects of that same person, you know. So sometimes the environment being even slightly different can lead to transformation, I think. But big question. I do think some people are have more flexibility and range of identity than others. I think some people really, that is them role-playing. It's not, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that's their range. Or at the very least, what they feel comfortable doing.
Okay, so I don't see anyone other. So one more question, because you've mentioned perspective taking and empathy as two different things. I've also seen the definition of empathy actually as taking a perspective. So how do you, for the sake of like your lecture and research, differentiate between the two?
I would say that empathy is not a verb, it's a feeling. Whereas perspective taking is a verb. So like, I don't empathy into my character. I perspective take into my character, and that helps me build empathy for my character, if that makes sense. There are many types of empathy and compassion, depends on who you're reading, but essentially there's two different types of empathy, major types of empathy, although I learned about a new one today called procedural empathy, which apparently can be taught. Anyway. Cognitive empathy, which is kind of what you're talking about, like what does it mean for me to imagine myself as this other person? And then emotional empathy, like what does it mean to feel like this other person or to have a similar kind of experience? But I would say that, yeah, maybe it's the verb thing. It's like, what are you doing that is provoking empathy? I think they're related, but I don't think everybody feels empathy. That's the thing. Somebody might perspective take and feel no empathy whatsoever. And I've known sociopaths in my life that are role players, you know. Not bad people, just they just don't. It's not the way their mind works. All right. Y'all are so great. Toughen it out. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.